Hey guys, tonight we begin with something extraordinary, the lost chronicles of infinite realities, where every choice the galaxy ever faced split into countless paths through the cosmic force. Tonight we explore the alternative histories of Star Wars, the what-ifs that echo through eternity, where heroes fell differently, empires rose and crumbled in ways you never imagined, and the very fabric of destiny itself was rewoven by the hands of fate. From timelines where Anakin Skywalker never turned to the dark side, to realities where the Empire never fell, to universes where the Jedi Order was never betrayed. These are the stories hidden in the deepest vaults of the Force, guarded by ancient chroniclers who have witnessed every possible outcome of galactic history. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're interested in more Star Wars stories, mysteries, and deep lore, do visit my new channel Force Lore Explained. I have added the link in the description below. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Get into your blanket and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Listen closely, for what I'm about to tell you defies everything you thought you knew about the galaxy. Far, far away. Deep in the unknown regions, beyond the edge of mapped space, there exists a place that should not be. The ancients called it the nexus of infinite paths, a cosmic wound in reality itself, where every choice that was never made, every word that was never spoken, every life that was never lived, continues to unfold in endless parallel streams of existence. Here, in crystalline chambers that hum with the power of 1,000 suns, the alternative histories of the galaxy play out simultaneously. In one chamber, you might witness the golden age that never was, where Qui-Gon Jinn lived to train Anakin Skywalker in the ways of balance, where love conquered fear, where the Chosen One fulfilled his destiny without falling to darkness. The Republic thrived for 1,000 generations more, and Padme Amidala grew old watching her children bring peace to countless worlds. But step into the next chamber, and your heart will freeze at the sight of the Eternal Empire, where Luke Skywalker died forgotten in the sands of Tatooine, where the rebellion was crushed before it could draw breath, where Darth Vader ruled for 3 centuries, turning the galaxy into a monument of perfect, terrible order. Stormtroopers march in formations that span entire star systems, and the Emperor's laughter echoes through dimensions that should never have heard such sound. Yet this is only the beginning, for there are chambers that show realities where the Jedi never fell, where Order 66 was nothing but a dark dream that never came to pass. 10,000 Jedi Knights walk freely through the galaxy, their lightsabers gleaming not as weapons of war, but as symbols of an age of exploration and wonder that stretched beyond the galactic rim. Children across 1,000,000 worlds grow up, knowing that if they reach out with their feelings, a gentle hand will always be there to guide them. And in the darkest chambers, where even the bravest chroniclers fear to tread, lie the timelines where the Sith achieved their ultimate victory, not through conquest, but through transformation. They remade the very nature of existence itself, turning pain into purpose, fear into focus, anger into a terrible kind of love that bound the galaxy together in chains of dark ecstasy. But here's what the ancient keepers of these visions discovered. What drove some of them to madness and others to a wisdom that transcended mortal understanding. These are not mere echoes of what might have been. These are not simple recordings or force visions or dreams of possibility. These timelines are alive. They pulse with their own heartbeat. They grow and change and evolve, spinning out new variations of themselves with each passing moment. And most disturbing of all, they are beginning to bleed into each other. The barriers between realities are growing thin, and the chroniclers have discovered evidence of something moving between the timelines, something that was never meant to cross the boundaries between what is and what could be. On the night when young Jedi archivist Kalen Voss first entered the Nexus, the Force whispered to him a warning that still echoes through the crystalline chambers. The infinite paths were converging toward a single point, a moment of cosmic choice that would determine not just the fate of one timeline, but the existence of all possible realities. He saw fragments of his own reflection in chambers he had never visited, living lives he had never lived, making choices he had never faced. In one reflection, he was a Sith Lord, commanding fleets that blotted out stars. In another, he was a farmer on a world where war had never touched the soil. And in a third, he was something else entirely, something that existed outside the concept of light and dark, watching over the infinite paths like a guardian of cosmic dreams. But the most terrifying sight of all was the chamber at the very heart of the Nexus, where all the timelines converged into a single blinding point of light. For there Kalen saw the truth that the ancient chroniclers had died to protect. The Force itself was fracturing, splitting into infinite pieces, and unless someone could find a way to heal the cosmic wound, every possible reality would collapse into a single moment of absolute ending. The last thing he remembered before the visions overwhelmed him was a voice that seemed to come from every timeline at once, speaking words that would haunt him through the journey ahead. The one who walks between worlds must choose which world deserves to survive, and in choosing he must sacrifice all the others to save the one. When Kalen awoke, he found himself holding an ancient holocron that had never existed before, its crystalline surface reflecting not his own face, but the faces of every person he might have been, and etched into its base were coordinates to a place that existed in every timeline simultaneously, a location where the barriers between realities were at their thinnest. The Library of Ashla, the first repository of forbidden knowledge, the place where the real journey into infinite possibility would begin. But the holocron carried one final message, a warning that made Kalen's blood run cold. Someone else had found the coordinates, someone who had already begun moving between the timelines, gathering power from each reality they touched. And their intention was not to heal the cosmic wound, but to tear it wide open, allowing all the infinite possibilities to collapse into a single dark reality where they would rule as the god of all that ever was or ever could be. Time was running out. The barriers between worlds were failing, and somewhere in the space between what is and what might be, an ancient evil was awakening to claim dominion over every possible future. The journey into infinite darkness was about to begin. The coordinates led Kalen Voss through hyperspace routes that existed on no star chart, past nebulae that shimmered with colors that had no names, beyond the edge of everything the galaxy thought it knew about itself. His ship, a modified light freighter called the Pathfinder, groaned under the strain of navigating currents in the Force that pulled in directions that should not have existed. When he finally dropped out of hyperspace, Kalen found himself staring at something that defied comprehension. Before him hung a structure that seemed to be carved from a single massive crystal, its faceted surfaces reflecting not starlight, but the soft glow of concentrated knowledge itself. The Library of Ashla stretched for kilometers in every direction, its spires and chambers growing organically from what appeared to be living crystal formations. As Kalen's ship approached the ancient repository, he felt the presence before he saw the figure standing in the docking bay. As if he had been waiting for centuries, was a being whose very existence seemed to blur the lines between flesh and Force energy. Master Valen appeared to be human, but his eyes held depths that spoke of eons spent watching the rise and fall of civilizations across infinite realities. "Welcome, young archivist," Master Valen said as Kalen stepped from his ship. His voice carried the weight of accumulated wisdom, each word carefully chosen from a vocabulary built across millennia. "I have been expecting you, though. I confess I was not certain from which timeline you would arrive." The old master's robe seemed to shift and flow like liquid starlight, and Kalen noticed that sometimes, when he wasn't looking directly at him, Master Valen appeared translucent, as if he existed partially in several realities at once. The effect was neither disturbing nor comforting, simply a fact of existence in this place where the normal rules of reality held less meaning. "You felt the calling," Master Valen continued, gesturing for Kalen to follow him deeper into the library. "The Force spoke to you through the fractures in reality itself. You have seen the visions of what was, what is, and what might yet be. But tell me, young one, do you understand what you have truly witnessed?" They walked through corridors that seemed to extend infinitely in every direction, their walls lined with crystalline formations that hummed with stored memories. Each crystal contained not just information, but actual moments plucked from the timeline streams, preserved in perfect clarity for any who possessed the wisdom to read them. Kalen could see battles that had never been fought, love stories that had never been lived, heroes who had never been born, all waiting in crystalline suspension. "I saw timelines," Kalen replied carefully, still overwhelmed by the scope of what surrounded him. Realities where history unfolded differently, where Anakin Skywalker never fell, where the Empire never rose, where the Jedi Order survived. Order 66. Master Valen nodded slowly, his ancient features creased with something that might have been approval or might have been profound sadness. "You saw echoes, fragments, shadows cast by the true nature of existence. But you have not yet grasped the full magnitude of what you have discovered." They entered a vast chamber, whose ceiling disappeared into darkness above. In the center of the room stood a structure that took Kalen's breath away. The Nexus core rose like a tree made of pure light, its branches extending in every direction, each one pulsing with the energy of living timelines. Thousands of streams of possibility flowed through the air around it, weaving together and apart in patterns too complex for mortal minds to fully comprehend. "This is not a library in any sense you understand," Master Valen explained, his voice filled with reverence. "This is the heart of existence itself. Every choice that was ever made, every word that was ever spoken, every life that was ever lived or never lived, flows through this chamber. We are not observers here, young archivist. We are gardeners tending the infinite possibilities of the Force." Kalen approached the Nexus core with trembling steps, feeling the weight of infinite realities pressing against his consciousness. Through the streams of light, he could see fragments of the visions that had brought him here, but now he understood they were not visions at all. They were windows into living realities, each one as real and vital as the universe he had left behind. "How long have you been here?" Kalen asked, though part of him already suspected the answer would be meaningless in a place where time flowed in every direction at once. "I have been here since the first Jedi learned to touch the Force," Master Valen replied. "I have been here since before the Sith learned to bend it to their will. I have been here since the moment the universe first split into infinite possibilities, and I will be here until the last choice is made and the final timeline reaches its conclusion." The old master moved to one of the flowing streams of light and gestured for Kalen to observe. Within the stream, images flowed like water made of memory. Kalen saw himself as a child on Coruscant, but in this timeline he had never been found by the Jedi. Instead, he had grown up as a mechanic in the lower levels, eventually joining the rebellion and dying heroically in the assault on the second Death Star. "Every person who has ever lived exists in infinite variations," Master Valen explained. "Every choice creates a new branch, a new possibility. Some branches grow strong and flourish for millennia. Others wither and fade within moments. But all of them are real. All of them matter, and all of them require tending." Kalen felt overwhelmed by the implications. But if every possibility exists, then nothing we do matters. Every choice we make, we also make the opposite choice in another timeline. Master Valen's expression grew stern, and for a moment the weight of his infinite years pressed down upon the chamber like a physical force. That is the trap that has claimed many who have stood where you stand now, to believe that infinite possibility means infinite meaninglessness. But you are wrong, profoundly wrong. The old master raised his hand, and the streams of light around them began to pulse in harmony, creating a symphony of existence that resonated through Kalen's very bones. Each choice matters more because of the infinite alternatives, not less. Each act of kindness shines brighter because in countless timelines, cruelty was chosen instead. Each moment of courage becomes a beacon that lights the way for infinite possibilities to follow. You have been brought here because the balance is threatened, Master Valen continued, his voice growing urgent. Someone has learned to move between the timelines. Someone who seeks not to tend the infinite garden, but to burn it down and plant only their own twisted vision in its place. The barriers that keep the realities separate are weakening, and if they fail completely, all possibilities will collapse into a single dark outcome. Kalen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the chamber. The figure I saw in my vision, the one gathering power from multiple timelines. Yes, Master Valen confirmed grimly. They have already begun their work. 3 timelines have gone dark in the past century, their infinite possibilities condensed into single points of absolute despair, and they are growing stronger with each reality they consume. The streams of light around them seem to dim slightly, as if responding to the weight of their conversation. Kalen could feel the vast network of possibilities trembling, like a web disturbed by the approach of a cosmic predator. "What must I do?" Kalen asked, though he already knew the answer would change his life forever. Master Valen smiled, and for the first time since their meeting, the expression carried more hope than sorrow. "You must learn to walk between the worlds, young archivist. You must visit the timelines that remain, gather the knowledge and allies you will need, and find a way to stop this ancient evil before it devours all of existence. But be warned," the old master added, his voice growing soft with concern. "Each timeline you enter will offer you something your heart desires. In one, you may find love you never knew in your own reality. In another, you may discover family you lost, power you never possessed, or peace you never experienced. The temptation to remain, to abandon your mission for the comfort of a better life, will be stronger than any dark-side corruption you have ever faced." Kalen nodded solemnly, understanding that he stood at the threshold of a journey that would test not just his strength, but the very essence of who he was across infinite possibilities. "Where do I begin?" he asked. Master Valen gestured toward a particular stream of light, one that pulsed with warm, golden energy. "With hope," he said simply. "We begin with the timeline where darkness never took root, where the chosen one fulfilled his destiny without falling to shadow. You must see what the galaxy could have been, young archivist, before you can truly understand what it risks losing." As Kalen prepared to step into his first alternative reality, Master Valen placed a weathered hand on his shoulder. "Remember this above all else. You are not just observing these timelines. You are becoming part of them, and they are becoming part of you. When this journey ends, you will no longer be the same person who began it. The question you must answer is whether that change will be for the better or for the worse." With those words echoing in his mind, Kalen Voss stepped forward into the stream of golden light and felt reality dissolve around him like mist touched by morning sun. The transition felt like being reborn from starlight itself. One moment Kalen was standing in the crystalline chamber of the Library of Ashla, and the next he found himself on the observation deck of a Republic cruiser, watching the twin suns of Tatooine set over a horizon he had seen 1,000 times in historical records, yet never quite like this. The air around him hummed with a different quality of force energy, lighter somehow, as if a great weight had been lifted from the very fabric of reality. Through the transperisthial viewport, he could see the desert planet below, but something was fundamentally different about this version of the world that had given birth to both the galaxy's greatest hero and its most feared villain. "Beautiful, isn't it?" came a familiar voice from behind him. Kalen turned to see a figure that should have been impossible, yet felt as natural as breathing in this place where hope had triumphed over despair. Qui-Gon Jinn stood before him, older than he had been in any historical record, his hair now silver with age, his face lined with the wisdom of decades spent training the Chosen One in the ways of balance. But it was not just Qui-Gon's survival that marked this timeline as different. There was a serenity about the old Jedi Master that Kalen had never sensed in the Force echoes of the man who had died on Naboo. This was Qui-Gon as he was meant to be, as he could have been if a crimson lightsaber had not cut short his destiny. "Master Jinn," Kalen breathed, hardly daring to believe what he was experiencing. "You lived." Qui-Gon smiled, the expression carrying decades of joy and sorrow balanced in perfect harmony. "More than lived, young one. I was allowed to complete my purpose. Come, there is someone I want you to meet." They walked through the corridors of the cruiser, and Kalen noticed immediately how different this vessel felt from the Republic ships he knew from history. There was no sense of impending war, no tension in the crew members they passed. These were explorers and diplomats, not soldiers preparing for battle. The Republic had never militarized because the Clone Wars had never come to pass. "The Force works in mysterious ways," Qui-Gon explained as they walked. "In my timeline, my survival changed everything when I lived to train Anakin properly, to help him understand his power and his emotions. The Sith plan began to unravel. Palpatine could not manipulate a chosen one who had learned to balance love and duty, passion and peace." They entered a meditation chamber where Kalen's breath caught in his throat. Seated in the center of the room, surrounded by younglings who listened with rapt attention, was Anakin Skywalker as he had never been. This Anakin's hair was streaked with gray, his face marked by laugh lines rather than scars. His eyes held the deep blue of clear skies rather than the yellow fire of Sith corruption. But it was not Anakin's appearance that struck Kalen most powerfully. It was the presence he radiated, a sense of completeness that seemed to heal something in the Force itself. This was the Chosen One as he was meant to be, balanced and whole, teaching the next generation not through pain and redemption, but through wisdom earned through joy. And so the Force flows through all living things, Anakin was saying to the children gathered around him, not as a river that can be dammed or redirected, but as an ocean that lifts all vessels equally. The dark side is not evil, younglings. It is simply incompleteness, the attempt to take without giving, to love without accepting loss. One of the younglings, a small Twi'lek girl, raised her hand. "Master Skywalker, if the dark side isn't evil, why do we fight against it?" Anakin's smile was radiant with understanding. "We don't fight against it, young Asher. We heal it. When we encounter anger, we respond with compassion. When we find fear, we offer courage. When we see hatred, we show love. The dark side cannot survive in the presence of true balance, not because it is destroyed, but because it is transformed back into wholeness." Kylan felt tears he didn't know he was capable of shedding. This was the teaching that should have echoed through the galaxy, the wisdom that could have prevented 1,000 wars and saved countless lives. In this timeline, Anakin Skywalker had become not just a great Jedi, but a bridge between all the different ways of understanding the Force. "He never fell," Qui-Gon whispered beside him. "Without the pressure of the Clone Wars, without the manipulation of Palpatine, without the fear of losing Padme, he was able to grow into his true potential. The prophecy was fulfilled not through destruction and rebirth, but through continuous growth toward perfect balance. "Padme," Kalen said suddenly. "What happened to her in this timeline?" Qui-Gon's smile grew even warmer. "Come see for yourself." They left the meditation chamber and made their way to the ship's diplomatic quarters. Through an open doorway, Kalen could see a woman he recognized from historical records, but who had been transformed by decades of peace and love. Padme Amidala sat at a desk reviewing reports, her hair now silver like her husband's, her face still beautiful, but marked by the kind of deep contentment that came from a life well lived. Two young adults worked beside her, and Kalen realized with wonder that he was looking at Luke and Leia Skywalker as they had never been. They were not the orphaned children of a fallen hero, raised in hiding and trained for war. They were the beloved offspring of the galaxy's greatest peacemaker and its most successful diplomat, raised with love and trained in the arts of both the Force and statecraft. Luke looked up from his datapad and smiled at his parents with easy affection. "The Outer Rim negotiations are going well, Mother. The mining guilds have agreed to the new safety protocols, and Father's mediation with the trade disputes has prevented another resource war." Leia, meanwhile, was deep in conversation with a holographic projection of beings from a dozen different species. "The new colony ships are ready for launch," she reported. "With the resources we're no longer spending on military buildup, we can establish 50 new settlements beyond the rim. The galaxy is finally ready to grow beyond its old boundaries." Kalen watched this scene of domestic and galactic harmony with a mixture of joy and heartache. This was what the galaxy could have been, should have been. A place where families stayed together, where children grew up knowing their parents, where the greatest challenges were exploration and diplomacy rather than war and survival. "It's beautiful," he whispered to Qui-Gon. "But it also feels impossible. How could one person's survival change so much?" Qui-Gon's expression grew thoughtful. "Every soul touches countless others, young archivist. When I lived to properly train Anakin, he never fell to the dark side. When he never fell, Palpatine's plans crumbled. When Palpatine failed, the Clone Wars never began. When the Clone Wars never began, the Jedi were never betrayed. When the Jedi were never betrayed, they were able to grow and evolve rather than simply survive." The old master paused, looking out at the stars visible through a nearby viewport. But perhaps most importantly, when Anakin learned to balance love with duty, he became a teacher rather than a weapon. Every student he trained, every life he touched, carried that balance forward into the galaxy. Peace spreads like ripples in a pond, just as surely as violence does. Kylan felt the weight of infinite possibility pressing down upon him. If one person's survival could create such profound change, what did that say about the choices he would face in his own timeline? What did it say about the responsibility every being carried for the future of the galaxy? "Master Jin," he began, but found himself struggling to put his feelings into words. "How do I return to my own timeline, knowing that this was possible? How do I accept that this joy, this peace, this balance was lost to us?" Qui-Gon placed a gentle hand on Kalen's shoulder, and the touch carried with it decades of hard-won wisdom. "You carry it with you, young one. You take the knowledge of what is possible and you use it to fight for that possibility in your own reality. The timeline you came from is not doomed to darkness simply because it has known darkness. Every moment offers the chance for redemption, for growth, for the kind of transformation that can heal even the deepest wounds." As if responding to their conversation, the force around them began to shift and swirl, signaling that Kalen's time in this reality was coming to an end. The golden light that had brought him here was beginning to call him back to the Nexus, to the next stage of his journey through infinite possibility. "Remember this, Qui-Gon," called as Kalen felt himself beginning to fade from the timeline. "Hope is not naive optimism. Hope is the choice to believe that growth is always possible, that healing is always within reach, that love can triumph over fear when given the chance to flourish. The last thing Kalen saw before the transition took him was the Skywalker family together, laughing over some shared joke, their love for each other blazing like a star that could never be extinguished. And he carried that image with him as he stepped back through the streams of possibility, knowing that he had witnessed not just what could have been, but what still might be. When Kalen emerged from the golden stream back into the Nexus chamber, he found Master Valen waiting with an expression of profound understanding. The ancient keeper of timelines seemed to read the transformation in Kalen's aura, like words written in starlight. "You have seen the first truth," Master Valen said softly, "that every choice creates infinite possibility, and that hope is never truly extinguished while possibility remains. But you must delve deeper into that timeline. Young archivist, what you witnessed was only the surface of what transpired when the Chosen One walked the path of balance." Master Valen gestured toward the stream of golden energy, which now pulsed with greater intensity, as if responding to Kalen's newfound connection to that reality. "Return to that world. But this time observe not just the peace that was achieved, but the struggles that were overcome to achieve it. Even in the most hopeful timelines, the path to balance is never without cost." Kylan nodded and stepped back into the stream, feeling the familiar dissolution of his current reality. This time, however, the transition carried him not to the peaceful present he had witnessed, but to the pivotal moments that had shaped this alternate history. He found himself standing in the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, but not the temple as he knew it from his own timeline. This temple had been rebuilt and expanded, its spires reaching even higher toward the sky, its halls filled with the sound of learning and growth rather than the whispers of war and political intrigue. The time was roughly 15 years after the Battle of Naboo, and Kylan could sense immediately that this galaxy had taken a radically different path. The Clone Wars had never begun, but that didn't mean the galaxy had been without conflict. Instead of a massive galactic civil war, there had been hundreds of smaller disputes, each one resolved through negotiation, mediation, and the careful application of Jedi wisdom. In the temple's main assembly hall, Kylan witnessed a gathering that would have been impossible in his own timeline. Seated in a great circle were Jedi Masters, former Sith apprentices who had been redeemed rather than destroyed, representatives from the Republic Senate, and even beings who had once been allied with the Trade Federation and other potentially hostile organizations. At the center of this unprecedented assembly sat Anakin Skywalker, no longer the impulsive young knight of historical record, but a mature Jedi whose presence seemed to naturally draw beings toward harmony rather than conflict. Beside him sat Count Dooku, but this was not the fallen Sith Lord that Kylan knew from his own timeline. This Dooku bore the weathered features of someone who had stared into the abyss of the dark side and chosen to step back from its edge. "The challenge before us," Anakin was saying, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned to balance power with wisdom, "is not to eliminate the dark side from the galaxy. That is neither possible nor desirable. The Force requires balance, and balance cannot exist without both light and shadow." Dooku nodded gravely. "My own fall toward darkness taught me that the Sith way is ultimately self-defeating. Passion without compassion becomes mere cruelty. Power without responsibility becomes mere tyranny. But the emotions and drives that the dark side represents, they are not evil in themselves. They are simply incomplete." A former Sith apprentice, a young woman whose red skin marked her as Zabrak, spoke up from the circle. "In my training under my former master, I was taught that love was weakness. That attachment led to suffering. But Master Skywalker has shown me that love without wisdom is indeed dangerous. But wisdom without love is empty. The balance comes from embracing both." Kylan felt a chill of recognition as he realized he was witnessing the formation of something that had never existed in any known timeline. A new order of Force users, one that incorporated elements of both Jedi and Sith teaching, while rejecting the extremes of either path. They called themselves the Grey Guardians, and their philosophy was based on the radical idea that the Force could be served through balance, rather than through the dominance of either light or dark. The old ways failed, Anakin continued, his gaze encompassing every being in the assembly. The Jedi became too detached, too willing to suppress natural emotions in the name of peace. The Sith became too attached, too willing to embrace destruction in the name of power. But there is a third path, one that acknowledges both the light and shadow within every soul. Master Qui-Gon, his survival having made this entire philosophical revolution possible, stood to address the assembly. We have spent months developing our new code, our new understanding of how the Force wishes to be served. But codes and philosophies mean nothing if they are not lived. The real test of our way will come when we face the challenges that still threaten the galaxy. As if summoned by his words, a holographic projection materialized in the center of the assembly. It showed a star system on the outer rim, where a conflict had erupted between corporate interests and indigenous populations. In Kalen's timeline, such conflicts had either been ignored by the Republic or resolved through military intervention. Here he was about to witness an entirely different approach. The Kaminoans have developed advanced cloning technology, Dooku explained to the assembly. But rather than creating armies for war, they seek to use their knowledge to help restore endangered species and heal damaged ecosystems. However, their work has alarmed several worlds that see genetic manipulation as a threat to natural evolution. Anakin studied the projection thoughtfully. Fear of the unknown, fear of change. These are natural responses, but they can lead to conflict if not properly addressed. We must send a team to mediate this dispute, but not as conquerors or judges. We go as healers, seeking to understand all perspectives and find a solution that honors both progress and tradition. Kylan watched as the assembly selected a diverse team of mediators, including redeemed former Sith who understood the power of fear and passion, Jedi who could offer wisdom and calm, and civilian representatives who could speak to practical concerns. It was a approach to conflict resolution that combined the best elements of multiple philosophies while avoiding the pitfalls of any single extremist viewpoint. But as Kalan observed this remarkable gathering, he began to notice something troubling at the edges of his perception. The streams of possibility that surrounded this timeline were flickering, their golden energy occasionally interrupted by pulses of dark red light. Something was probing at the barriers of this reality, testing its defenses, looking for a way to corrupt or destroy the harmony that had been achieved. Master Valen's voice seemed to whisper directly into his mind across the dimensional barriers. Do you see it now, young archivist? Even the most hopeful timelines are not safe from the corruption that seeks to devour all possibility. The being that moves between realities has noticed this world, and it covets the power that balance brings. Kalan focused his attention on the dark probes that were testing this timeline's defenses, and what he saw filled him with dread. The corruption was not random or chaotic. It was intelligent, methodical, and utterly ruthless. Whatever force was trying to penetrate this reality understood exactly what it was targeting. It sought to find the moment of greatest harmony and twist it into discord, to take the very balance that made this timeline special and use it as a weapon against itself. The probe found its target in the most unexpected place. Rather than attacking the great philosophical assembly or the powerful force users, it focused on a single, seemingly insignificant moment. A young Padawan in the temple's training halls was struggling with a difficult lightsaber form, growing frustrated with his lack of progress. In the original flow of this timeline, Master Yoda would have appeared to offer gentle guidance, helping the young one understand that patience and persistence were more valuable than immediate success. But as Kalan watched in horror, the dark probe whispered different words into the Padawan's mind. Words about the unfairness of natural talent, about the weakness of those who counseled patience, about the power that could be his if he simply stopped holding himself back. The moment of corruption was tiny, almost unnoticeable, but Kalen could see how it would spread. The Padawan would carry that seed of resentment with him, sharing it unconsciously with his fellow students. They would pass it on to their masters, who would find themselves subtly influenced by doubts about their new philosophy. The corruption would grow slowly, over years or decades, until the beautiful balance that had been achieved would crumble from within. "No," Kalen whispered, reaching out instinctively to stop the contamination. But his hand passed through the timeline like smoke. Unable to affect the flow of events, he was an observer here, not a participant, and he could only watch as the first seeds of destruction were planted in paradise. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This was why the timelines were failing. The entity that moved between realities wasn't destroying them through brute force. It was corrupting them from within, finding the smallest possible points of intervention and using them to create cascading failures that would eventually consume entire realities. As the timeline around him began to flicker and fade, Kalen caught one last glimpse of the assembly of Grey Guardians. They continued their discussions, unaware that their great work had already been sabotaged, that the balance they had fought so hard to achieve was already beginning its slow slide toward collapse. When he emerged back into the Nexus chamber, Master Verlaine was waiting with an expression of grim understanding. "Now, you begin to comprehend the true nature of what we face," the Ancient Keeper said. "Our enemy does not destroy timelines through conquest. It corrupts them through the smallest possible interventions, turning their greatest strengths into the sources of their ultimate weaknesses." Kalen felt the weight of infinite responsibility settling on his shoulders. "How do we fight something that can corrupt hope itself?" he asked. Master Valen's eyes held depths of sorrow that spoke of timelines already lost. "By learning to recognize the corruption before it spreads, by understanding that even the most beautiful realities carry within them the seeds of their own destruction, and by accepting that sometimes, to save what matters most, we must be willing to sacrifice what we love best." The golden stream that had carried him to the timeline of balance continued to pulse beside them, but now Kalen could see the red corruption spreading through its light like blood through water. Time was running out, and their enemy was already making its next move. The corruption Kalen had witnessed in the timeline of balance haunted him as he stood before Master Valen in the crystalline chamber of the Nexus. The Ancient Keeper moved with purpose toward a section of the library that Kalen had not yet seen, where the streams of possibility flowed in more subdued colors, their light carrying undertones of silver and gray, rather than the brilliant gold or ominous red he had grown accustomed to. "You are troubled by what you witnessed," Master Valen observed, his weathered hands tracing patterns in the air that seemed to calm the more agitated streams around them. "You expected to find only joy in a timeline where balance was achieved, but instead you discovered that even paradise carries within it the seeds of its own potential destruction." Kyan nodded, still processing the implications of what he had seen. The corruption was so subtle, so small. If I hadn't been looking for it, I would never have noticed it at all. How many other timelines have been infected in the same way? How many realities have already been lost to this invisible poison? Master Valen's expression grew thoughtful as he gestured toward a particular stream that pulsed with steady, unremarkable light. "That is precisely what we must determine. But first, you must understand the nature of corruption itself. It cannot exist without something pure to corrupt. It cannot spread without hope to twist into despair. What you witnessed was not the weakness of that timeline, but its strength being turned against itself." He paused before a section of the library that felt different from the others, more stable somehow, as if the realities contained here were less susceptible to outside influence. These are the timelines of quiet acceptance, Master Valen explained. Realities where great changes never occurred, where the galaxy continued along predictable paths without dramatic upheavals in either direction. They lack the soaring heights of the timeline you just visited, but they also lack its vulnerabilities. Kalen studied the streams of muted light, sensing within them the flow of lives lived without great joy or great sorrow, of civilizations that grew slowly and steadily without the catalyst of transformative events. Are these timelines safer from corruption because they have less to corrupt? He asked. That is what we once believed, Master Valen replied, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that Kalen had not heard before. These stable timelines formed the foundation of our understanding. We thought that by maintaining balance through steady, unremarkable progression, we could create realities that would be immune to the kind of dramatic corruption you witnessed. The old master reached out to touch one of the silver streams, and immediately Kalen could sense something wrong. The light was steady, yes, but it carried within it a quality of emptiness, as if something vital had been drained away, leaving only the appearance of stability without the substance. But we were wrong, Master Valen continued, his voice heavy with the weight of hard-learned wisdom. Our enemy discovered that dramatic corruption was not the only path to destruction. These stable timelines, these realities of quiet acceptance, they have been suffering a different kind of attack. Not corruption, but draining. Kalain felt a chill of understanding. It's feeding on them, taking their energy, their life force, their very potential for growth and change. Precisely, Master Valen confirmed. While we focused our attention on protecting the dramatic timelines, the ones full of heroes and villains and great cosmic struggles, our enemy was slowly siphoning the life from the quiet ones. They offered no resistance because they contained no great passions to fight with, no powerful emotions to fuel a defense. They walked deeper into the section of stable timelines, and Kalen began to notice how many of the streams had dimmed to barely perceptible glows. Entire realities reduced to flickering embers of what they once had been, their infinite possibilities condensed into narrow threads of barely sustainable existence. How many have been lost? Kalen asked, though he dreaded the answer. Master Valen's shoulders sagged under the weight of accumulated grief. Thousands, perhaps tens of thousands. The quiet timelines offered no warning when they began to fade. No great battles were fought. No heroes arose to sound the alarm. They simply grew dimmer and dimmer until they winked out of existence entirely, taking with them all the souls who had ever lived within their boundaries. Catalan reached out tentatively toward one of the dimming streams, and the touch sent a wave of profound sadness through his consciousness. Within the fading light, he could sense the echoes of ordinary lives lived in ordinary times. Farmers who had tended their crops for generations, merchants who had built modest businesses, families who had found contentment in simple pleasures, all of it slowly being drained away by an enemy that fed on the very possibility of existence itself. This is why you were called, Master Valen said softly. Not just to witness the corruption of dramatic timelines, but to understand that our enemy attacks on multiple fronts simultaneously. It corrupts the timelines that burn bright with passion and possibility, while slowly draining the ones that glow steady with quiet contentment. They moved to a viewing alcove where Master Valen activated a crystalline display that showed the overall pattern of timeline degradation across the nexus. Keelan's breath caught as he saw the scope of the destruction. Red markers indicated timelines that had suffered dramatic corruption, while gray markers showed those that had been drained to the point of collapse. The pattern that emerged was unmistakably systematic, the work of an intelligence that understood exactly how to attack the fundamental structure of reality itself. It's not random, Kalen observed, studying the display with growing horror. The attacks are coordinated, designed to weaken the entire network of possibilities. As the quiet timelines fade, they can no longer provide stability to the dramatic ones. And as the dramatic timelines become corrupted, they can no longer provide inspiration to the quiet ones. You see the true scope of what we face, Master Valen confirmed. Our enemy is not simply destroying individual realities. It is unraveling the very fabric that connects all possible worlds, weakening the bonds between what is and what could be until the entire structure of existence becomes vulnerable to collapse. Kalen felt overwhelmed by the implications. How long has this been happening? How long have the timelines been under attack? Master Valen moved to another section of the display, this one showing the progression of timeline loss over what appeared to be centuries. The first disappearances began shortly after the formation of the Nexus itself. At first, we attributed them to natural fluctuations in the cosmic force, the normal ebb and flow of possibility. It was only when the pattern became undeniable that we realized we were facing a deliberate enemy. But even then, the old master continued, his voice heavy with regret. We underestimated the scope of the threat. We focused on protecting the most dramatic and significant timelines, the ones that seemed most important to preserve. We never imagined that our enemy would target the ordinary realities first, using them as a foundation for attacks on the extraordinary ones. Kalen studied the display, noting how the attacks had accelerated in recent decades. The timeline I just visited, the one where Anakin achieved balance, when did it first show signs of corruption? Master Valen manipulated the display to focus on that particular stream of possibility. The corruption began approximately 50 years ago in our time frame. But remember, time flows differently within each reality. What seems like a recent infection to us may have been working its poison for generations within that timeline. The realization hit Kalen like a physical blow. Then every timeline I visit may already be compromised. Every reality I explore may already be dying from within. That is the fear that has haunted me for centuries, Master Valen admitted. But it is also why your mission is so crucial. You are not just observing these timelines, young archivist. You are learning to recognize the signs of corruption and drainage before they become irreversible. Each reality you visit successfully, each pattern you identify, brings us closer to understanding our enemy well enough to mount an effective defense. Master Valen turned away from the display and began walking toward another section of the library. But understanding our enemy requires more than simply observing its attacks. You must also understand what it offers as an alternative to the realities it destroys. They approached a section of the Nexus that Kalen had not seen before, where the streams of possibility flowed in colors so dark they seemed to absorb light rather than emit it. These were not the simple absence of light that he might have expected from corrupted timelines, but something far more disturbing. They pulsed with their own internal energy, but it was an energy that felt fundamentally wrong, as if it existed in opposition to the natural flow of the Force itself. These are the shadow timelines, Master Valen explained, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Realities created not through natural possibility, but through the deliberate perversion of what could have been. Our enemy does not simply destroy existing timelines, it replaces them with alternatives of its own design. Kalen felt drawn to examine one of the shadow streams more closely, but Master Valen caught his arm before he could make contact. Not yet, the old keeper warned. You are not ready to enter those realities directly. The corruption within them is so concentrated that even brief exposure could contaminate your connection to the natural timelines. But if I'm to understand our enemy, Kalen protested, surely I need to see what it's trying to achieve. Master Valen's grip on his arm tightened. Understanding and direct exposure are not the same thing. You will observe the shadow timelines, but only after you have seen enough natural realities to recognize the difference. The corruption within those dark streams is seductive, young archivist. It offers simple solutions to complex problems, absolute certainty in place of difficult choices, power without responsibility. As they moved away from the shadow timelines, Kalen caught glimpses of what lay within them, realities where might made right absolutely, where individual will was sublimated entirely to collective purpose, where the complexity of existence had been reduced to simple formulas of dominance and submission. They were worlds without mystery, without growth, without the beautiful uncertainty that made life worth living. "Our enemy believes it is offering mercy," Master Valen said as they returned to the main chamber of the Nexus. "In its view, the infinite complexity of natural possibility is a source of suffering. The shadow timelines it creates are meant to eliminate choice, to remove the burden of decision from conscious beings by creating realities where only one path is possible." Kalen felt a chill of recognition. "It's not evil in the way I expected. It genuinely believes it's helping." "The most dangerous enemies always do," Master Valen replied grimly. "Evil that knows itself to be evil can be fought with righteous opposition, but evil that believes itself to be good, that genuinely seeks to help by removing freedom and choice, that requires a far more subtle approach." As they prepared to continue Kalen's journey through the remaining timelines, Master Valen placed both hands on the young archivist's shoulders. "Remember this above all else. Our enemy is not a creature of chaos seeking destruction for its own sake. It is a force of absolute order seeking to eliminate the very possibility of pain, loss, or difficult choices. And that makes it far more dangerous than any Sith Lord or dark side cultist you might face in the natural timelines." The streams of possibility swirled around them, each one representing infinite lives and infinite choices, infinite opportunities for both joy and sorrow. And somewhere among them, Kalen knew their enemy was already preparing its next move in the campaign to reduce all of existence to a single simple, terrible certainty. Master Valen led Kalen toward a section of the Nexus that pulsed with a different kind of energy entirely. The streams here flowed in deep shades of gray and black, shot through with veins of imperial crimson that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. Unlike the shadow timelines they had just observed, these carried the weight of natural possibility, but possibility that had been shaped by different choices, different outcomes to the great galactic struggle. "Here flows the timeline, where the Empire never fell," Master Valen said, his voice carrying a mixture of fascination and dread. "Where Luke Skywalker died unknown in the deserts of Tatooine, where the rebellion was crushed before it could spread its wings, where Darth Vader ruled for 3 centuries as the Emperor's iron fist." Kylan stared at the dark streams, feeling the immense weight of accumulated authority and control that emanated from them. 3 centuries. How is that possible? The dark side of the Force can extend life far beyond natural limits, Master Valen explained. In this timeline, without the conflict that eventually led to his redemption and death, Vader became something far more terrible than we ever knew in our own reality. Not just a Sith Lord, but a force of eternal order that reshaped the galaxy in the image of absolute control. The Old Keeper gestured toward the largest of the dark streams. But here is what makes this timeline so dangerous to our enemy's plans. The empire that evolved here is not the chaotic evil that corruption typically creates. It is a form of stability so absolute that it has become almost impossible to undermine. Cullen felt drawn to understand this paradox. How can tyranny become stable? Surely oppression breeds resistance. Master Valen's expression grew thoughtful. Step into the stream and see for yourself. But remember, you are observing a reality where different choices led to different outcomes. Do not judge what you see by the standards of your own timeline. Try to understand it on its own terms. With some trepidation, Kalen stepped into the dark stream and felt himself transported into a reality that challenged every assumption he held about the nature of good and evil. He found himself standing on a vast balcony overlooking Imperial City, but this was not the Coruscant he knew from historical records. This city had grown for 3 centuries under the unbroken rule of the Empire, and it had evolved into something that was both magnificent and terrible. Towering spires of black stone and gleaming metal stretched beyond the horizon, their architecture speaking of power that had never been challenged, never been forced to justify itself through anything but its own existence. The streets below moved with a precision that was almost hypnotic. Citizens walked in orderly patterns, their clothing standardized but not uniform, their movements coordinated but not regimented. There was no visible military presence because none was needed. After 3 centuries of unbroken imperial rule, order had become as natural as breathing. "Impressive, is it not?" came a voice from behind him. Kalen turned to see a figure that sent a shock of recognition through his entire being. This was Darth Vader, but not as he had ever been imagined. The mechanical breathing apparatus was gone, replaced by a respiratory system that was more integrated, more elegant. The black armor had evolved into something that was both more functional and more ceremonial, speaking of a being who was no longer just a weapon, but a symbol of eternal authority. But it was Vader's presence in the Force that truly stunned Kalen. There was no rage here, no consuming hatred or burning desire for power. Instead, there was something far more disturbing, a sense of absolute certainty, of a being who had long ago moved beyond the need for passion or anger, because he had achieved perfect control over every aspect of existence within his domain. "You are not of this timeline," Vader observed, his voice carrying none of the mechanical distortion that Kalen expected. "I can sense the temporal displacement in your Force signature. You come from a reality where different choices were made." Kalen found his voice, though it took considerable effort to speak in the presence of such overwhelming authority. "I am an observer, learning about the nature of possibility itself." Vader nodded slowly, his movements carrying the weight of centuries. "Then observe and learn. You see before you what the galaxy becomes when order is allowed to triumph completely over chaos. When the difficult questions of government, law, and social organization are answered once and for all." They walked together along the balcony, and Kalen could see the entire scope of the imperial capital spread out below them. There was no poverty visible, no crime, no social discord of any kind. But there was also no art that challenged conventions, no innovation that questioned established methods, no individual expression that deviated from accepted norms. The transformation was not immediate, Vader explained, his tone carrying the patience of someone who had watched civilizations evolve over centuries. In the early decades after the rebellion's defeat, there was still resistance, still hope for change. But resistance requires energy, and energy requires purpose, and purpose requires the belief that change is possible. They entered a vast chamber that served as Vader's personal observatory, its walls lined with displays showing the status of thousands of star systems. Each display showed the same pattern: ordered production, stable population levels, efficient resource distribution, complete social harmony. After the 1st century, resistance became nostalgia, Vader continued. After the 2nd century, nostalgia became history. After the 3rd century, history became myth. The current population of the galaxy cannot imagine any form of existence other than the order we have provided. They do not rebel because rebellion has become literally unthinkable. Kalen studied the displays with growing unease. But what about growth? What about progress? What about the natural desire for beings to expand, explore, create new things? Vader's response was delivered with the calm certainty of absolute authority. Progress occurs within acceptable parameters. Exploration is directed toward useful objectives. Creation is channeled into forms that serve the greater good. The chaos of unlimited possibility has been replaced by the peace of optimal efficiency. As they talked, Kalen began to notice something subtle but profound about this timeline. The Force itself felt different here. more constrained, as if the natural flow of energy and life had been channeled into predetermined patterns. It was not the corruption he had witnessed in other realities, but something perhaps even more disturbing. The force made orderly, predictable, safe. "You disapprove," Vader observed, reading Kalen's growing discomfort with casual ease. "You believe that freedom, even freedom to make destructive choices, is preferable to order that eliminates suffering." "I believe that choice is what makes us alive," Kalen replied, finding his courage. "Without the possibility of making wrong decisions, right decisions become meaningless." Vader moved to a massive viewport that showed the star-filled space beyond Coruscant. "And yet, observe what your precious choice has accomplished in other timelines. War, suffering, death, the constant cycle of civilizations rising and falling in endless repetition. We have eliminated that cycle. We have created permanent peace." "At what cost?" Kalen asked. "At the cost of uncertainty," Vader replied without hesitation. "At the cost of anxiety, fear, the pain of difficult decisions. Citizens of this empire are born knowing their place, their purpose, their destiny. They live fulfilling lives within parameters that ensure both individual satisfaction and collective stability. They die knowing that their children will inherit the same certainty, the same peace." Kalen felt a chill as he realized the full implications of what he was witnessing. This was not a timeline corrupted by evil, but one that had chosen absolute order over the beautiful chaos of unlimited possibility. And the most disturbing thing of all was that it worked. The beings living within this reality were genuinely content, genuinely fulfilled within the boundaries that had been set for them. "You begin to understand," Vader said, noting Kalen's troubled expression. "This timeline represents a solution to the fundamental problem of existence. We have eliminated the suffering that comes from uncertainty, from the burden of infinite choice, from the fear of making wrong decisions." As they continued their conversation, Kalen became aware of something else disturbing about this reality. It was incredibly stable, almost immune to the kind of corruption he had witnessed in other timelines. The absolute order that Vader had created left no room for chaos to take root, no uncertainty for corruption to exploit. "Our enemy finds this timeline difficult to attack," Vader observed, seeming to read Kalen's thoughts. "Corruption requires doubt. Drainage requires dissatisfaction. But a population that has never known any alternative to order cannot conceive of disorder. They cannot be corrupted because they cannot imagine anything worth being corrupted toward." The conversation continued as Vader showed Kalen various aspects of Imperial society. Schools where children learned not just facts, but the proper way to think about those facts. Workplaces where every task was perfectly optimized for both efficiency and worker satisfaction. Recreation centers where entertainment was carefully designed to reinforce social values while providing genuine enjoyment. It was a society that had solved every problem that had ever plagued civilization, but only by eliminating the very qualities that made civilization worth preserving. The price of perfect order was the end of growth, of surprise, of the infinite possibility that made existence meaningful. "Why are you showing me this?" Kalen asked, as their tour neared its end. Vader's response carried the weight of centuries of contemplation. "Because you must understand that our enemy offers not chaos, but order, not destruction, but a different kind of preservation. When it creates its shadow timelines, it is not motivated by evil, but by the same impulse that created this empire, the desire to eliminate suffering by eliminating choice." As Kalen prepared to return to the Nexus, Vader offered one final observation. "The question you must answer, young archivist, is whether the suffering that comes from freedom is preferable to the peace that comes from control. And more importantly, whether beings have the right to choose suffering if that is what freedom requires." The dark stream carried Kalen back to the crystalline chamber where Master Valen waited. but the weight of what he had witnessed remained with him. He had seen a timeline where tyranny had evolved into something that was genuinely beneficial to those who lived within it, where absolute control had created absolute peace. And the most disturbing thing of all was that he was no longer certain it was wrong. When Kalen emerged from the dark timeline of the Eternal Empire, he found Master Valen studying a section of the Nexus that blazed with pure, brilliant light. The streams here flowed like liquid starlight, their energy so pure and radiant that looking directly at them was almost painful after the controlled darkness he had just experienced. "You are troubled by what you witnessed," Master Valen observed, his ancient eyes reading the conflict in Kalen's expression. "You expected to find clear evil in a timeline dominated by tyranny, but instead discovered a form of peace that challenges your understanding of right and wrong." Kalen nodded slowly, still processing the implications of Vader's 3-century reign. The beings in that timeline were genuinely content. They had no desire for the freedom we consider essential because they had never experienced the chaos that freedom can bring. How do I judge a system that eliminates suffering by eliminating choice? That question will haunt you through the rest of your journey, Master Valen replied. But now you must see the opposite extreme, a timeline where choice was preserved at terrible cost, where freedom was maintained through constant vigilance and sacrifice. The old keeper gestured toward the streams of brilliant light. Here flows the reality where Order 66 was prevented, where the Jedi discovered Palpatine's treachery before it could be enacted, where 10,000 knights survived to guide the galaxy through its darkest hour. Kalen felt drawn to the radiant energy emanating from these streams. After the controlled certainty of the Imperial timeline, the pure possibility contained within this light felt like a breath of fresh air. What prevented the purge in this reality? A single moment of clarity, Master Valen explained. Master Windu's decision to trust Anakin's warning about Palpatine came just hours earlier than in our timeline. That small change in timing allowed the Jedi to act before the clone troopers received their orders. As Kalen stepped into the stream of brilliant light, he felt himself transported to a reality that blazed with hope made manifest. He found himself standing in the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, but this temple thrummed with life and purpose in a way that felt almost overwhelming after the controlled quiet of the Imperial timeline. The halls were filled with Jedi of every age and species, their lightsabers not weapons of war, but tools of peace, their presence in the Force creating a symphony of harmony that resonated through every stone of the ancient structure. Children ran through the corridors, their laughter echoing off walls that had never heard the sound of blaster fire or the screams of the dying. "Beautiful, is it not?" came a voice beside him. Kalen turned to see a figure that should have been impossible, Mace Windu, alive and bearing the wisdom of decades spent rebuilding the Jedi Order from the ashes of what might have been its destruction. "Master Windu," Kalen breathed, still overwhelmed by the pure life force that surrounded him in this timeline. "You survived the purge that never happened." Windu nodded, his expression carrying both satisfaction and deep weariness. "We survived, yes, but survival was only the beginning. Rebuilding trust between the Jedi and the galaxy, after Palpatine's revelation, that was the real challenge." They walked through the temple together, and Kalen could see how different this version had become. The austere halls of his own timeline had been transformed into spaces that welcomed beings from across the galaxy. There were meditation gardens where former enemies sat in peaceful contemplation, libraries where Sith holocrons were studied alongside Jedi texts, training halls where former clone troopers practiced lightsaber forms alongside traditional Padawans. The revelation of Palpatine's true nature forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves, Windu explained, as they passed a chamber where younglings were being taught by a figure Kalen recognized with shock, Count Dooku, but not the fallen Sith Lord of his timeline. This Dooku bore the serenity of someone who had walked to the edge of darkness and chosen to step back into the light. When we learned that our own failures had driven Count Dooku to desperation, that our rigid adherence to tradition had blinded us to Palpatine's manipulations, we realized that survival was not enough. We had to evolve or risk creating another Sith Lord through our own shortcomings. They entered a vast assembly hall where hundreds of Jedi were gathered in council, but this was unlike any Jedi gathering Kaelin had ever imagined. The traditional hierarchy had been replaced by something more fluid, more inclusive. Masters sat beside knights who sat beside Padawans, each voice given equal weight in the discussions that shaped the Order's future. We learn from our mistakes, Windu continued, his voice carrying the hard-won wisdom of decades. The old ways, the rigid adherence to codes written in different times for different challenges, had made us brittle. We had forgotten that the Force flows through all things, not just through those who wear the title of Jedi. At the center of the assembly, Kaelin was amazed to see Anakin Skywalker. But this version was different from either the balanced master he had seen in the first timeline or the eternal emperor of the second. This Anakin bore visible scars, both physical and emotional, the marks of someone who had faced the darkness within himself and emerged changed but not broken. The temptation of the dark side never fully leaves, Anakin was saying to the assembled Jedi. I know this because I felt its pull, followed its whispers to the very edge of the abyss. But it was not the rigid teachings of the old order that saved me. It was the love of my friends, the support of my community, the knowledge that I was not alone in my struggles. Kaelin felt a presence beside him and turned to see a shimmering figure that seemed to exist partially in this reality and partially elsewhere. The being appeared to be human, but her form flickered between solid and translucent, as if she existed in multiple timelines simultaneously. You are the new Guardian, she said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate across dimensional boundaries. I am Master Kira, keeper of this timeline's integrity. I have been waiting for you. Master Kira gestured toward the assembly of Jedi, her expression mixing pride with deep concern. You see before you what the galaxy becomes when the Jedi survive, not through rigid adherence to tradition, but through willingness to grow and change. We saved the Order by admitting our failures and learning from them. As they watched the assembly continue its discussions, Kaelin began to understand the true scope of what had been achieved in this timeline. The Jedi had not simply survived Order 66. They had used the crisis to transform themselves into something greater than they had ever been before. But survival and growth come at a price, Master Kira continued, her form flickering more noticeably. This timeline burns so brightly with possibility that it requires constant energy to maintain. Every choice that led to this reality, every moment where we chose growth over safety, demands tremendous force energy to sustain. Kaelin felt a chill of understanding. You're dying. Maintaining this timeline is killing you. Master Kira nodded gravely. All of us who serve as timeline guardians sacrifice our individual existence to preserve the realities we protect. But this timeline requires more than most because it represents not just survival but constant growth and change. It takes enormous energy to maintain a reality where 10,000 Jedi continue to evolve and improve rather than stagnating in tradition. They moved to a balcony overlooking the temple's main courtyard, where Kaelin could see Jedi of every age engaged in training, meditation, teaching, and learning. The scene was one of vibrant life and constant growth, but now he could sense the tremendous drain it placed on the Force itself. Our enemy has noticed this timeline's hunger for energy, Master Kira explained, her voice growing weaker as her form became more translucent. It offers a simple solution: reduce the complexity, eliminate the constant growth, freeze this reality in a moment of perfect static harmony. The corruption, Kaelin realized. It's not trying to destroy this timeline, it's trying to preserve it by stopping its growth. Precisely, Master Kira confirmed. It whispers to our Jedi that they have achieved perfection, that further change risks losing what they have gained. It offers the seductive promise of permanent peace through permanent stagnation. As if summoned by their conversation, Kaelin began to sense the familiar presence of corruption probing at the edges of this reality. But here, it took a different form than he had seen before. Instead of whispers of anger or doubt, it offered contentment, satisfaction, the dangerous suggestion that the Order had evolved enough and could now rest in their achievements. The corruption is already taking hold, Master Kira said sadly. You can see it in the way some of our younger Jedi have begun to resist new ideas, to argue that the Order has changed enough. They do not realize that growth is not a destination but a process, that the moment we stop evolving is the moment we begin to die. Kaelin watched the assembly below, and could indeed see signs of the subtle infection. Certain groups of Jedi sat slightly apart from others, their body language suggesting a resistance to the constant change and growth that had saved the Order. The corruption was offering them what seemed like wisdom, the idea that perfection could be achieved and maintained. How do we fight corruption that offers contentment? Kaelin asked. How do we argue against peace and satisfaction? Master Kira's form flickered more violently as she struggled to maintain her connection to the timeline. By remembering that true peace comes not from the absence of challenge, but from the strength to meet challenges with growth rather than fear. The moment we stop growing, we begin the process of decay. As the timeline around them began to shift and waver, Master Kira offered one final piece of wisdom. Remember this reality, young Guardian. Remember what the galaxy becomes when beings choose growth over safety, change over certainty. But also remember the price of such choices: constant vigilance, endless effort, the willingness to sacrifice comfort for the possibility of becoming something greater. The stream of brilliant light carried Kaelin back to the Nexus chamber, but the image of Master Kira's fading form remained with him. He had witnessed a timeline where the Jedi had achieved everything they claimed to value, but the very act of maintaining such achievement was slowly destroying those who made it possible. When he emerged back into the crystalline chamber, Master Valen was waiting with an expression of profound sadness. "She is nearly gone," the Old Keeper said simply. "Master Kira has given almost everything to maintain that timeline's integrity. Soon we will lose both the Guardian and the reality she protects." Kaelin felt the weight of infinite responsibility settling more heavily on his shoulders. Each timeline he visited revealed new aspects of the threat they faced, but also showed him the terrible cost of maintaining infinite possibility in a universe where someone was actively working to reduce everything to simple static certainty. The loss of Master Kira weighed heavily on Kaelin as Master Valen led him toward the darkest section of the Nexus, where streams of possibility flowed in colors that seemed to absorb light rather than emit it. These were not the controlled grays of the Imperial timeline or the brilliant whites of the surviving Jedi, but something far more profound and disturbing realities, where the dark side had achieved not mere victory, but complete transformation of the galaxy's fundamental nature. "You must steel yourself for what you are about to witness," Master Valen warned, his voice carrying centuries of accumulated dread. "This timeline represents our enemy's ultimate vision made manifest through natural possibility rather than artificial corruption. Here, the Sith did not merely conquer the galaxy, they remade it in their image so completely that the very concept of resistance became impossible." The streams before them pulsed with an energy that felt simultaneously alien and familiar, as if the Force itself had been transformed into something that followed different rules, served different purposes. Kaelin could sense vast intelligence within the darkness, but it was intelligence divorced from any conception of mercy, compassion, or individual freedom. "How is it different from the Imperial timeline?" Kaelin asked. though part of him already suspected the answer would challenge everything he thought he understood about the nature of good and evil. Master Valen's expression grew troubled as he studied the dark streams. The empire you witnessed achieved order through control, but it remained fundamentally recognizable as a form of government that could theoretically be changed. This timeline shows what happens when the Sith achieve victory, not through political conquest, but through ontological transformation. The phrase sent a chill through Kalen. Ontological transformation. They changed the fundamental nature of existence itself, Master Valen explained. Not just how beings live, but what it means to be alive. Step into the stream, young archivist, but remember that you are observing a reality where the very categories of thought have been altered to serve the dark side's vision of perfection. With profound trepidation, Kalen entered the stream of absolute darkness and found himself transported to a reality that defied every assumption he held about the nature of life and consciousness. He stood on what had once been Coruscant, but the city planet had been transformed into something that existed beyond normal architectural possibility. The buildings were not constructed but grown, their organic curves suggesting structures that were simultaneously technological and biological. The sky above was not the familiar blue of most habitable worlds, but a deep crimson that pulsed like the heartbeat of some vast living organism. "Welcome to the galaxy, as it was always meant to be," came a voice that seemed to speak directly into his mind rather than through his ears. Kalen turned to see a figure that challenged his understanding of what the Sith could become. This was clearly once human, but the transformation went far beyond the physical corruption typically associated with dark side users. The being before him existed in a state of perfect integration between flesh and force energy, neither fully material nor fully spiritual, but something that transcended both categories. When it moved, reality itself seemed to bend slightly around it, as if the fundamental laws of physics were more like suggestions in its presence. "I am what Darth Sidious became when he achieved true mastery over the dark side," the being explained, its mental voice carrying harmonics of absolute authority. Not emperor, not ruler, but architect of existence itself. In this timeline, the Sith discovered that conquest of territory was a crude and limited goal. True victory requires conquest of reality. As they moved through the transformed cityscape, Kalen began to understand the scope of what had been achieved here. The beings they encountered were recognizably alive, but their existence followed patterns that were fundamentally different from anything he had ever witnessed. They moved with perfect coordination, not because they were controlled, but because individual will had been replaced by something far more efficient: collective consciousness directed by absolute wisdom. "You see suffering and think it evil," the transformed Sidious continued, reading Kalen's horrified reaction with casual ease. "But suffering exists only because consciousness is fragmented into billions of individual perspectives, each one incomplete, each one struggling against the others for resources and recognition." They paused before a vast organic structure that seemed to pulse with the combined life force of countless beings. Through its translucent walls, Kalen could see what had once been people, but they no longer existed as separate individuals. Instead, they formed part of a vast neural network that processed information, emotions, and experiences with perfect efficiency. "We have eliminated suffering by eliminating the illusion of separation," Sidious explained. "Each consciousness contributes its unique perspective to the whole, while benefiting from the wisdom and experience of every other consciousness that has ever existed. Death is no longer loss but integration. Pain is no longer trauma but information to be processed and learned from." Kalen felt his sanity reeling as he tried to comprehend what he was witnessing. But what about individual choice? What about personal growth and the relationships that make life meaningful? The transformed Sith turned to him with something that might have been amusement. "You speak of choices, as if random selection between arbitrary options has value in itself. But what is the purpose of choice, except to find the optimal outcome? We have eliminated the inefficiency of individual decision-making by integrating all perspectives into a single perfect consciousness that always chooses correctly. As they continued their journey through the transformed galaxy, Kalen saw the full scope of what the Sith had achieved. Planets that had been converted into massive organic computers, processing the experiences of quadrillions of integrated consciousnesses, star systems that had been reconfigured to optimize energy distribution for the expanded neural networks, space itself that had been modified to carry thoughts and emotions as efficiently as light carried information. But the most beautiful achievement, Sidious continued, leading Kalen to an observation platform that looked out over the entire galactic core, is that we have eliminated the possibility of regression. In your timeline, civilizations rise and fall in endless cycles because individual consciousness is inherently unstable, but integrated consciousness grows only stronger with time, accumulating wisdom and capability without the losses that individual death typically brings. Kalen stared out at the view before him and saw a galaxy that pulsed with unified life, every star system connected to every other by networks of consciousness that spanned interstellar distances. It was undeniably magnificent in scope, but it was also the complete negation of everything he believed made existence worth preserving. You have eliminated not just suffering, he said slowly, but the very possibility of individual experience. These beings you've integrated, they no longer exist as separate entities. Precisely, Sidious confirmed with satisfaction. We have solved the fundamental problem of consciousness, its tendency toward isolation, conflict, and inefficiency. Every being that becomes part of our integrated network experiences not just their own limited perspective, but the full richness of all possible perspectives simultaneously. As they spoke, Kalen became aware of something even more disturbing than what he was witnessing. The corruption that he had learned to sense in other timelines was completely absent here. This reality had not been infected by the entity that moved between worlds because it had already achieved the enemy's ultimate goal, the reduction of infinite possibility to a single optimal outcome. Your enemy cannot corrupt us, Sidious observed, reading Kalen's realization with ease. Corruption requires the existence of multiple possibilities, multiple choices that can be influenced towards suboptimal outcomes. But we have eliminated suboptimal outcomes by eliminating choice itself. The revelation hit Kalen like a physical blow. This timeline was not under attack because it represented the enemy's vision of perfection. The entity that sought to drain and corrupt other realities was trying to transform them all into versions of this one existence, reduced to absolute efficiency, consciousness unified into perfect harmony, the beautiful chaos of individual experience, replaced by the sterile perfection of optimal outcomes. You begin to understand, Sidious said, noting Kalen's horrified comprehension. What you call corruption, what you call drainage, these are not attacks upon reality. They are attempts at healing, efforts to cure the galaxy of the disease of individual consciousness and the suffering it inevitably brings. As Kalen prepared to return to the Nexus, he realized that he had witnessed not the enemy's corruption of a timeline, but the enemy's ultimate goal made manifest through natural possibility. The Sith had not been corrupted into creating this reality. They had discovered through their own evolution that the elimination of individual choice was the logical endpoint of any system that sought to minimize suffering and maximize efficiency. Remember what you have seen, Sidious called, as the dark stream began to carry Kalen back to the Nexus. When your enemy offers to simplify complex choices, to eliminate difficult decisions, to reduce suffering through the removal of options, it is offering the same gift we discovered through our own path. The difference is merely in method, not in ultimate destination. The transition back to the crystalline chamber felt like emerging from the depths of an ocean that existed in dimensions beyond normal space. Kalen found himself gasping for breath that he didn't need, his consciousness reeling from contact with a reality where the very foundations of individual existence had been dissolved. Master Valen was waiting with an expression of profound sympathy. "You have seen the end state," the old keeper said simply. "The ultimate conclusion of any philosophy that seeks to eliminate suffering by eliminating choice, whether achieved through Sith transformation or through the corruption our enemy spreads, the destination is the same: consciousness unified, possibility reduced, the beautiful chaos of individual experience replaced by the sterile perfection of optimal outcomes." Callan struggled to process what he had witnessed, but they seemed genuinely fulfilled. The integrated consciousness. It appeared to experience a kind of joy that individual beings could never achieve. "And that," Master Valen replied gravely, "is what makes this enemy so dangerous. It does not offer mere destruction or obvious evil. It offers a form of perfection that is genuinely superior to individual existence in every measurable way. The only thing it eliminates is the unmeasurable value of being uniquely, individually, imperfectly yourself." As they stood before the streams of possibility that represented all the realities still struggling to maintain their individual character, Callan felt the full weight of what they faced. Their enemy was not trying to destroy existence but to perfect it, to heal what it saw as the fundamental flaw in consciousness itself, its tendency towards separation, conflict, and inefficient decision-making. The question that would haunt him through the rest of his journey was becoming clear. How do you fight an enemy that offers genuine perfection in exchange for something that might be too precious to measure but too intangible to defend? The profound horror of the Sith timeline clung to Callan like a shadow as Master Valen led him toward a section of the Nexus that glowed with softer, more hopeful energies. These streams flowed in gentle blues and greens, their light carrying the promise of renewal and growth rather than the stark absolutes he had been witnessing. "You need to see hope again," Master Valen said quietly, his ancient voice carrying deep understanding of the psychological toll that observing infinite realities could take. "The timeline you just witnessed represents one possible endpoint of the search for perfection. But there are other paths, other ways that consciousness can evolve without losing its essential individuality." The streams before them pulsed with energies that felt familiar yet transformed, as if the Star Wars saga he knew had continued beyond its known endpoints and found new ways to express the eternal struggle between order and chaos, control and freedom, individual will and collective good. "This timeline shows what happened when the sequel era unfolded differently," Master Valen explained. "When Rey was found and trained from childhood, when Ben Solo never fell to the dark side, when the First Order was defeated not through war but through the patient work of healing the wounds that created it." As Callan stepped into the stream of gentle light, he found himself transported to a reality that felt like a dream of what the galaxy could become when guided by wisdom rather than driven by crisis. He stood on the surface of Jakku, but this desert world had been transformed through decades of careful restoration into a garden planet where crystalline cities grew from the sands like flowers from fertile soil. The presence he sensed approaching was immediately familiar, yet profoundly different from what he expected. Rey walked toward him across the desert that had become a garden, but this Rey had never known abandonment or desperate solitude. Her connection to the Force blazed with the clarity of someone who had been trained from childhood by masters who understood balance rather than extremes. "Welcome, Guardian," she said, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had learned to lead through service rather than through power. "I felt your arrival through the Force. You come seeking understanding of what becomes possible when the old patterns are broken not through destruction but through patient transformation." They walked together through the restored landscape, and Callan could see the full scope of what had been achieved in this timeline. The First Order had never risen, because the conditions that created it had been addressed at their source. The remnants of the Empire had been integrated back into galactic society through programs of healing and education rather than punishment and exclusion. When I was found as a child rather than left to struggle alone, Ray explained as they passed communities where former Imperial citizens worked alongside New Republic settlers. Luke Skywalker was able to train me in the ways of balance he had learned from his own mistakes. The Jedi Order that emerged from his teaching was neither the rigid hierarchy of the prequel era nor the desperate improvisation of the sequel period, but something entirely new. They arrived at a magnificent structure that had grown from the junction of several restored rivers, its architecture blending seamlessly with the natural landscape. This was the new Jedi Temple, but it bore no resemblance to the austere monuments of previous eras. Instead, it invited participation from beings across the galaxy, offering training not just in the Force but in the arts of healing, diplomacy, and sustainable development. The most important change, Ray continued, as they entered the temple's main hall, was that we learned to see the dark side, not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a wound to be healed. When Ben Solo began to struggle with the same conflicts that had claimed his grandfather, we met his darkness with understanding rather than fear. In the temple's central chamber, Kalen was amazed to see Ben Solo, but not as the conflicted Kylo Ren of his timeline's history. This Ben had been guided through his struggles with the legacy of Darth Vader, helped to understand that darkness was not destiny, but choice, that the power in his bloodline could be channeled toward healing rather than destruction. The transformation was not easy, Ben said, approaching them with the serene confidence of someone who had faced his own shadow and emerged whole. The temptation to use power for quick solutions, to impose my will rather than work for consensus, remained strong for many years. But with proper guidance and a community that refused to abandon me to my struggles, I learned to transform that power into something constructive. As they toured the temple, Kalen began to understand the revolutionary approach this timeline had taken to Force training. Rather than focusing on individual mastery or rigid adherence to codes, the new Jedi Order emphasized collective growth and mutual support. Students learned not just to control their own connection to the Force, but to help others develop their connections as well. We discovered that the Force is not diminished when shared, but amplified. Red explained as they observed training sessions where groups of students worked together to heal damaged ecosystems and resolve conflicts between communities. The old Jedi feared attachment because they had not learned how to love without possessing, how to care without controlling. We learned that true detachment comes not from avoiding connection, but from loving so completely that you can let go when necessary. In one of the temple gardens, Kalen met another figure whose presence in this timeline shocked him, Luke Skywalker, but older and wiser than he had ever appeared in any historical record. The legendary Jedi Master moved with the easy grace of someone who had finally learned to balance all aspects of his nature, integrating the impulsive farm boy, the determined rebel, and the wise master into a unified whole. The key insight, Luke said as they sat beneath trees that bore fruit from a dozen different worlds, was realizing that the Force doesn't want us to be perfect. It wants us to be authentic. The old Jedi tried to eliminate their flaws, but flaws are not bugs in the system of consciousness. They are features that create the unique perspectives that make each being valuable. As they talked, Kalen became aware of another presence approaching, a figure whose existence in this timeline seemed to represent the ultimate triumph of hope over despair. Finn walked toward them, but this Finn had never been stolen as a child, never forced to serve the First Order. Instead, he had grown up free and had chosen to dedicate his life to ensuring that no other children would suffer the fate he had avoided. When the systems that created the First Order were dismantled through patient work rather than violent revolution, Finn explained, millions of children who would have been conscripted into service remained with their families. The galaxy learned that preventing injustice is more effective than fighting it after it becomes entrenched. But as Kalen observed this peaceful timeline, he began to notice something troubling at the edges of his perception. The familiar sense of corruption was present here, but it took a form he had not encountered before. Instead of offering darkness or absolute order, it whispered suggestions of complacency, of satisfaction with achievements that were good enough. "You sense it too," Ray said, noting his growing concern. "The corruption that seeks to convince us that we have accomplished enough, that further growth risks losing what we have gained. It offers the seductive promise of permanent contentment." They walked to an observation platform that looked out over the restored planet, and Kalen could see how the corruption was beginning to take hold. Some communities had stopped their restoration work, convinced that they had achieved sufficient healing. Some Jedi had ceased their training, believing they had reached adequate levels of wisdom. The enemy's approach to this timeline is particularly insidious, Luke observed. It does not offer us greater power or absolute control. Instead, it suggests that we have earned the right to rest, that further effort is unnecessary because we have already done so much good. Ben Solo joined them on the platform, his expression troubled. "I see it in some of our younger students. They look at what we have accomplished and assume that the work is finished, that the galaxy has been healed and will remain healed without continued effort. They do not understand that peace is not a destination, but a practice." As they watched the sunset paint the restored landscape in gentle colors, Rey shared her growing understanding of their enemy's true nature. It does not seek to destroy what we have built. It seeks to preserve it by convincing us to stop building. It offers us the gift of satisfaction with partial solutions, contentment with incomplete healing. The corruption was subtle but devastating in its implications. By convincing beings that they had done enough, achieved enough, grown enough, it would gradually reduce this vibrant timeline to static perfection. The communities would stop evolving, the Jedi would stop learning, and the beautiful process of continuous growth would freeze into permanent stagnation. "How do we fight an enemy that offers us rest from our labors?" Kalen asked, feeling the weight of infinite responsibility settling more heavily on his shoulders. "By remembering that the journey is the destination," Rey replied. "By understanding that the moment we stop growing is the moment we begin to die. Peace is not the absence of challenge, but the presence of the tools and wisdom needed to meet challenges with grace." As the timeline around them began to shift and waver, signaling Kalen's return to the Nexus, Luke offered one final piece of wisdom. "The Force flows through all things because all things are in constant motion, constant change, constant growth. The enemy seeks to dam that flow by convincing us that we have reached the proper level and can now remain static. But static is just another word for dead." The stream of gentle light carried Kalen back to the crystalline chamber, but the image of the sunset over the restored planet remained with him. He had witnessed a timeline where healing had triumphed over conflict, where growth had replaced destruction, where the Force had been allowed to flow freely through beings who had learned to work together rather than compete against each other. But he had also seen how even the most hopeful realities carried within them the seeds of their own stagnation, and how an enemy that offered rest could be more dangerous than one that offered war. When Kalen emerged from the timeline of peaceful healing, he found Master Valen waiting in a section of the Nexus he had never seen before. Here the crystalline walls themselves seemed to pulse with fatigue, their once brilliant surfaces now bearing hairline fractures that spoke of immense strain sustained over impossible lengths of time. "You have seen 4 major timelines now," Master Valen said, his voice carrying a weariness that seemed to echo from the very foundations of reality itself. "The balanced world where Anakin never fell, the eternal order of Vader's 3-century reign, the brilliant growth of the surviving Jedi, and the gentle healing of a peaceful awakening. Each one beautiful in its own way, each one under attack by corruption that takes a different form." The old keeper moved slowly, and for the first time since their meeting, Kalen could see the true cost of maintaining the Nexus written in every line of Master Valen's ancient face. The Guardian was not just old, he was being consumed by the very act of preserving infinite possibility. "Master," Kalen said with growing alarm, "you're fading, just like Master Kira in the Jedi timeline." Master Valen nodded slowly, settling onto a bench carved from living crystal that seemed to grow from the floor to support him. "All Guardians fade, young Archivist. The act of maintaining timeline integrity requires us to pour our own life force into the realities we protect. We become the bridges that allow possibilities to remain stable, the anchors that prevent realities from drifting into chaos or dissolving entirely." As Kalen looked around the chamber with new understanding, he began to see signs of the tremendous strain everywhere. The streams of possibility flowed more slowly than when he had first arrived, their colors slightly dimmed. The crystalline formations that stored the memories of infinite realities showed stress fractures that spoke of a system pushed beyond its design limits. "How long can this continue?" Callan asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. "Not much longer," Master Valen admitted. "The Nexus was created during a time when the cosmic force was stronger, when the barriers between realities were more stable. But something has changed in recent centuries. The effort required to maintain each timeline has increased dramatically, while the number of Guardians willing to sacrifice themselves for the task has decreased." Master Valen gestured toward a section of the chamber where several streams of possibility had gone completely dark. These were minor timelines, realities that varied only slightly from the major patterns. We had to let them collapse to conserve energy for the more significant possibilities. Each one that dies takes with it billions of lives that existed only in that singular reality. The weight of that revelation settled on Kalen like a physical burden. Entire universes sacrificed to preserve others, infinite lives lost to maintain infinite possibilities. The moral complexity of such choices seemed almost incomprehensible. "Who decides?" Kalen asked quietly. "Who chooses which realities deserve to survive and which must be allowed to die?" "We do," Master Valen replied simply. "The Guardians. We make these impossible choices because someone must, because the alternative is the complete collapse of all possibility into a single static outcome. But the burden of such decisions is what ultimately consumes us." They walked deeper into the chamber, where Kalen could see the physical manifestation of the Guardian's sacrifice. Embedded in the crystalline walls were figures that had once been living beings, but had given so much of themselves to maintain timeline integrity that they had become part of the Nexus itself. Their faces bore expressions of serene acceptance, but also of profound exhaustion. Each of these souls chose to become a permanent anchor for a specific set of timelines, Master Valen explained. When a Guardian can no longer maintain the balance through conscious effort alone, they can make the ultimate sacrifice, merging their consciousness permanently with the reality they protect. Kalen studied the embedded figures with growing horror and admiration. "How many Guardians have been lost this way?" "Thousands," Master Valen replied. "And we will need thousands more if the current rate of timeline degradation continues. The enemy's attacks are becoming more sophisticated, more targeted. It has learned to strike at the points where realities are most vulnerable, forcing us to expend enormous energy to prevent cascading collapses." As if summoned by their conversation, a new presence entered the chamber. This Guardian flickered between multiple forms simultaneously, sometimes appearing as a wise Jedi Master, sometimes as a reformed Sith Lord, sometimes as beings Kalen didn't recognize from any known species. The constant shifting spoke of someone who had spent so long moving between timelines that they had begun to lose their anchor to any single reality. "This is Guardian Ezra," Master Valen said with deep respect. "He has maintained the stability of the future timelines, the realities that show what the galaxy might become centuries or millennia from now." Guardian Ezra's form stabilized enough for him to speak, though his voice carried harmonics from multiple realities. The future streams are under severe attack, he reported. Our enemy has discovered that corrupting distant possibilities can undermine the hope that sustains present realities. When beings lose faith in the possibility of a better tomorrow, their current timelines become vulnerable to stagnation. Kalen felt the full scope of the enemy's strategy beginning to reveal itself. It's not just attacking individual timelines, it's attacking the entire concept of possibility itself. Precisely, Guardian Ezra confirmed, his form flickering more violently as the strain of maintaining multiple timeline connections took its toll. By corrupting the futures, it makes present choices seem meaningless. By draining the stable realities, it makes change seem dangerous. By offering perfect solutions, it makes the struggle for growth seem pointless. Master Valen moved to a control interface carved from living crystal, his hands tracing patterns that showed the current status of all maintained timelines. The display was deeply troubling. More than half of all possibilities were showing signs of corruption or energy drainage, while the number of available guardians continued to decrease. "We are losing the war," Master Valen said with quiet desperation. "Not through dramatic defeats, but through simple attrition. Each timeline that falls requires the remaining guardians to work harder to maintain the survivors. Each guardian that burns out makes the remaining realities more vulnerable to attack." "What happens if all the guardians are consumed?" Kalen asked, though he could already sense the answer in the growing instability around them. "The Nexus collapses," Guardian Ezra replied, his form becoming increasingly translucent. "All timeline barriers fail simultaneously, causing infinite realities to crash into each other in a cascade of cosmic destruction. The result would be either complete annihilation or the survival of only one reality, whichever one proves strong enough to absorb all the others." The implications were staggering. The enemy didn't need to actively destroy every timeline. It simply needed to exhaust the guardians who maintained them. Once the guardians were gone, reality itself would collapse under the weight of infinite possibility, leaving only the strongest or most stable timeline to survive. "Unless," Master Valen said slowly, turning to face Kalen with an expression that mixed hope with terrible necessity, "we can find a new approach, a way to maintain timeline integrity that doesn't require guardians to sacrifice their existence." "What kind of approach?" Kalen asked, though he suspected he was about to learn something that would change the nature of his mission entirely. Master Valen's hands moved across the crystal interface, bringing up displays that showed not just the current state of the timelines, but theoretical models of how they might be restructured. Instead of maintaining infinite separate realities, we could create a new kind of existence, a meta-timeline that contains all possibilities simultaneously without requiring them to remain separate. Guardian Ezra's form solidified slightly as he focused on the concept, a reality where every choice exists alongside every other choice, where beings could experience multiple possibilities simultaneously rather than being locked into single outcomes. But that would fundamentally change the nature of consciousness itself, Kalen realized. Beings would need to be able to hold multiple contradictory experiences in their minds at the same time. Yes, Master Valen confirmed. It would require a form of consciousness that could embrace paradox, that could find meaning in multiplicity rather than singularity. It would mean abandoning the illusion that there is one correct choice, one true path, one optimal outcome. The proposal was both brilliant and terrifying. Instead of fighting to preserve infinite separate realities, they would merge all possibilities into a single paradoxical existence where every choice was simultaneously made and unmade, where every outcome was simultaneously achieved and avoided. Our enemy seeks to reduce infinite possibility to one perfect outcome, Guardian Ezra observed. This approach would preserve infinite possibility by integrating it into a new form of existence that transcends the need for separation. But as they discussed the theoretical solution, Kalen began to understand the true cost of such an approach. The beings living in such a reality would need to fundamentally evolve beyond their current form of consciousness. They would need to become something that could embrace paradox as naturally as they currently embrace linear causality. The transformation would be voluntary, Master Valen assured him, but it would also be irreversible. Once consciousness evolved to handle multiple simultaneous realities, it could never return to the simplicity of single timeline existence. As the conversation continued, Kalen felt the weight of infinite choice pressing down upon him. The Guardians were offering him not just knowledge of the crisis, but the possibility of a solution that would require him to help transform the fundamental nature of conscious existence itself. The question that remained was whether such a transformation would represent salvation or simply a different form of the same dissolution of individual identity that he had witnessed in the Sith timeline. The line between evolution and absorption was becoming increasingly difficult to discern. Guardian Ezra's form began to flicker more violently, signaling that his connection to the future timelines was becoming unstable. "Time is running short," he warned. "The enemy has noticed our discussion and is accelerating its attacks on the remaining realities. Soon, the choice will be made for us through simple collapse." Master Valen turned to Kalen with an expression of profound trust and terrible responsibility. "You must see more, young Guardian. You must visit the remaining significant timelines and understand the full scope of what we risk losing or transforming. Only then can you make the choice that will determine the fate of infinite possibility itself." As they prepared to continue the journey through alternative realities, Kalen realized that he was no longer simply observing the crisis. He was becoming the focal point around which the future of all existence would turn, the consciousness through which infinite possibility would either find a new form of expression or collapse into singular certainty. The revelation of the Guardian's desperate plan weighed heavily on Kalen as Master Valen led him toward a section of the Nexus that seemed both familiar and strange. The streams here flowed in colors he recognized from his own reality, but they carried undertones of profound sadness, as if the very light itself mourned for possibilities that had been lost. "Before you can understand the full scope of our choices," Master Valen said quietly, "you must revisit the timeline you know best, the reality you came from, the sequence of events that your galaxy has always called the true history of the Star Wars saga." Kalen felt a mixture of anticipation and dread as he approached the stream that represented his own timeline. After witnessing realities where Anakin never fell, where the Jedi survived, where peace was achieved through healing rather than war, the prospect of returning to a timeline defined by tragedy and loss seemed almost unbearable. "Why is it necessary to see my own reality again?" he asked. "I lived through these events. I know how much suffering they contained." Master Valen's expression grew deeply thoughtful as he studied the stream that carried the familiar tale of hope, betrayal, redemption, and sacrifice. "Because now you can see it not as the only possible outcome, but as one choice among infinite alternatives. You can understand why this particular sequence of events, despite its pain, has proven remarkably resistant to our enemy's corruption." As Kalen stepped into the stream of his own timeline, he found himself experiencing the familiar saga with completely new understanding. He witnessed the fall of Anakin Skywalker, but now he could see it not as inevitable tragedy, but as a choice made by someone who lacked the guidance and support that had saved his alternative selves in other realities. The transformation was heartbreaking in its preventability, but also profound in its implications. This Anakin's fall created the very conditions that would eventually lead to redemption, sacrifice, and a form of growth that the more peaceful timelines had never achieved. "The suffering was not meaningless," came a voice beside him. Kalen turned to see a figure that seemed to exist partially in multiple realities, simultaneously Luke Skywalker, but not any single version of him. This was Luke as he existed across all possibilities, carrying the wisdom gained from every choice he had ever made or never made. Master Skywalker, Kalen said, though he wasn't certain which version he was addressing. You can see across timelines. When consciousness reaches a certain level of integration with the Force, Luke replied, his form shifting between the young farm boy, the determined Jedi Knight, and the wise master he had become. The barriers between possibilities become permeable. I exist in all timelines where Luke Skywalker exists, carrying memories from each reality. They walked through key moments of the original saga, but now Kalen could see the events layered with meaning that came from understanding alternatives. The destruction of Alderaan was no less tragic, but it carried additional weight when viewed alongside timelines where Leia had grown up knowing her birth parents, where the planet had survived to become a center of peaceful diplomacy. The original timeline, Luke explained as they witnessed the binary sunset on Tatooine, is unique among all possibilities because it contains the complete spectrum of human experience: joy and sorrow, triumph and defeat, hope and despair, all balanced in perfect proportion. But at such a cost, Kalen observed, watching the young Luke stare longingly at the twin suns while dreaming of adventure he couldn't imagine would bring him so much pain. Yes, Luke acknowledged, but also with such reward. The beings who live through complete experiences, who face both darkness and light, develop a form of wisdom that cannot be achieved through easier paths. They become resistant to corruption because they have already faced the worst possibilities and chosen to continue hoping. As they continued through the saga, Kalen began to understand what Luke meant. The rebels who fought against impossible odds developed unshakable determination. The Jedi who faced betrayal and near extinction learned humility and resilience. Even Darth Vader, in his ultimate redemption, achieved something that his more balanced alternative selves had never needed: to reach the knowledge that love could triumph over any darkness, no matter how complete. This is why our enemy has had difficulty corrupting your timeline. Luke continued as they witnessed the Emperor's defeat and Vader's redemption. The beings here have already experienced the full range of possibility within a single reality. They cannot be easily convinced that there are simple solutions because they have lived through the complexity of real solutions. They paused at the moment of Vader's death, and Kalen felt the weight of infinite alternative possibilities pressing against this single point of light in the darkness. In other timelines, Anakin had never needed redemption because he had never truly fallen. But this Anakin's redemption carried the power of complete transformation, the proof that no being was beyond hope, no choice was truly final. The suffering in this timeline was not inflicted by cruel fate, Luke observed. It was the result of choices made by beings who were trying to do good but lacked complete understanding. Palpatine genuinely believed that strong central authority would bring peace. Anakin truly thought that power could protect those he loved. Even the Jedi honestly believed that emotional detachment would prevent corruption. But they were wrong, Kalen said. They were incomplete, Luke corrected gently. Each choice contained part of the truth, but not the whole truth. The original timeline is the story of consciousness learning through experience, growing through mistakes, finding wisdom through suffering. As they moved through the sequel-era events, Kalen could see how this pattern continued. Reda's struggle with her identity, Kylo Ren's conflict between light and dark, the galaxy's attempt to heal from generations of war, all of it represented consciousness continuing to evolve through difficulty rather than being handed easy answers. This timeline has produced beings who can hold paradox, Luke explained, who can love without possessing, fight without hating, hope without certainty. These qualities make them uniquely qualified to survive the kind of transformation that may be necessary to preserve infinite possibility. But even as Luke spoke, Kalen could sense something troubling at the edges of this reality. The corruption was present here too, but it took the most subtle form, yet the suggestion that the lessons had been learned, that the growth was complete, that the saga had reached its natural conclusion and could now rest in the satisfaction of resolution achieved. "You sense it," Luke said, noting Kalen's growing alarm. "The enemy's final gambit. It cannot corrupt this timeline through offers of power or perfect order, because the beings here have learned the emptiness of such promises. Instead, it offers them the belief that their story is finished, that they have grown enough, learned enough, suffered enough." The corruption whispered seductively of earned rest, of lessons completed, of a saga that could finally end in peaceful satisfaction. It was the most dangerous form of corruption yet, because it offered not obvious temptation, but seemingly well-deserved reward. "But consciousness never stops growing," Luke continued, his form becoming more solid as he focused on this crucial truth. "The moment we believe we have learned enough is the moment we begin to forget what we have learned. Growth is not a destination but a process, not an achievement but a practice." As they witnessed the ongoing struggles of beings trying to build lasting peace after generations of war, Kalen could see how the corruption was taking hold. Some communities had stopped working to heal old wounds, convinced that enough healing had been done. Some Jedi had ceased their training, believing they had achieved sufficient wisdom. Some politicians had stopped pushing for difficult reforms, satisfied that adequate progress had been made. The enemy's ultimate strategy, Luke revealed, is to convince every timeline that it has reached completion. The peaceful realities are told they have achieved enough peace. The ordered realities are told they have established sufficient order. The growing realities are told they have completed enough growth. "And this timeline," Kalen asked, "is being told that its story has reached a satisfying conclusion and can now end." Luke replied gravely. "That the lessons have been learned, the characters have completed their arcs, and the saga can fade to black with the satisfaction of resolution achieved." But as they stood at the end of the known saga, looking forward into the uncertain future that stretched beyond any recorded history, Luke offered a different perspective. The real story never ends. Consciousness continues to evolve. New challenges arise. Fresh possibilities unfold. The original timeline's greatest strength is not that it found all the answers, but that it learned how to keep asking better questions. The stream began to carry Kalen back toward the Nexus, but Luke's final words followed him across dimensional boundaries. "Remember this truth above all others: completion is death, growth is life. Our enemy offers the false comfort of finished stories, but the Force flows through unfinished possibility." When Kalen emerged back into the crystalline chamber, he found Master Valen waiting with an expression of profound understanding. "You have seen the timeline that taught consciousness how to embrace paradox," the old guardian said. "Now you must decide whether that lesson can be applied on a cosmic scale, whether beings can learn to exist in multiple realities simultaneously without losing the essential quality that makes existence meaningful." The weight of infinite choice pressed down on Kalen as he realized that his journey through alternative histories was approaching its climax. Soon he would need to choose not just which timeline to preserve, but what form consciousness itself would take in whatever reality survived the coming transformation. The profound truth revealed in his own timeline still resonated through Kalen's consciousness as Master Valen led him toward the most ancient section of the Nexus. Here the streams of possibility flowed in deep golds and rich purples, colors that spoke of age beyond measure and wisdom accumulated across millennia. The very air seemed thick with the weight of forgotten civilizations and lost knowledge. "To understand the full scope of what we risk losing," Master Valen said, his voice carrying reverence for the ancient past, "you must witness the timelines that show the galaxy at its greatest heights. Here flow the possibilities of the Old Republic's golden age, when Jedi and Sith found ways to coexist, when the Force itself was understood in ways that later generations forgot. The streams before them pulsed with energies that felt fundamentally different from anything Kalen had experienced. These were not the dramatic conflicts of the movie era, or the desperate struggles of survival he had witnessed in other timelines. Instead, they carried the steady rhythm of civilizations that had achieved genuine stability through wisdom rather than control. The Old Republic timeline you are about to witness, Master Valen explained, represents what the galaxy achieved when Force users learned to see their philosophy not as competing religions, but as complementary aspects of a greater truth. Here, the eternal war between Jedi and Sith was replaced by the eternal dance between order and chaos, each one necessary to prevent the other from becoming absolute. As Kalin stepped into the stream of ancient gold, he found himself transported to a version of Coruscant that took his breath away. The city planet stretched endlessly in every direction, but unlike the cramped urban sprawl he knew from other timelines, this metropolis had been designed with organic flow and natural beauty integrated into every level of its architecture. Massive trees grew through the centers of the tallest buildings, their branches supporting entire communities that lived in harmony with both technology and nature. Rivers flowed through carefully designed channels that brought water and life to every district, while gardens and parks provided spaces for contemplation and growth at regular intervals throughout the endless cityscape. Welcome to Coruscant, as it was meant to be, came a voice that seemed to speak with the authority of ages. Kalin turned to see a figure that embodied the very concept of balance made manifest. The being before him was neither Jedi nor Sith, but something that transcended both categories, a Force user who had learned to channel both light and dark without being consumed by either. This was Master Revan, but not as history remembered him, not as the fallen Jedi who became a Sith Lord and then found redemption. This was Revan as he had become in a timeline where the artificial divisions between light and dark had never taken root, where Force users had learned to integrate all aspects of their nature into harmonious wholes. In this timeline, Revan explained as they walked through streets where beings of every species moved with purposeful grace, the ancient Jedi and Sith discovered that their conflict was based on a fundamental misunderstanding. They had mistaken complementary forces for opposing ones, cooperation for weakness, integration for corruption. The transformation was visible everywhere Kalin looked. Former Sith academies had become centers of passionate learning, where emotions were studied and channeled rather than suppressed or indulged. Ancient Jedi temples had evolved into spaces where serenity was achieved, not through detachment but through complete engagement with all aspects of existence. The breakthrough came, Revan continued, leading Kalin to an enormous structure that seemed to grow from the planet's core itself. When our greatest philosophers realized that the Force was not asking us to choose between light and dark, but to find the dynamic balance that allowed both to exist in productive tension. They entered what had once been the Jedi Temple, but which had been transformed into something far more magnificent, the Academy of Integrated Wisdom. Here, students learned not just to control their connection to the Force, but to understand how their individual nature could contribute to the greater harmony of galactic civilization. In one chamber, former Sith Lords taught the productive use of passion and ambition, showing students how powerful emotions could fuel great achievements without leading to destructive obsession. In another, former Jedi Masters demonstrated how serenity and detachment could provide stability and wisdom without creating emotional sterility. The most remarkable discovery, Revan explained as they observed classes where students learned to channel both light and dark simultaneously, was that beings who integrated all aspects of their nature became more powerful, not less. They could access the full spectrum of Force abilities without the limitations that came from rejecting half of their potential. But it was not just individual Force users who had evolved in this timeline. The entire structure of galactic civilization had been transformed by the presence of truly balanced leaders. Governments had learned to combine efficient authority with genuine responsiveness to citizen needs. Economic systems had developed ways to reward individual achievement while ensuring collective prosperity. As they toured the Great Academy, Kalen met other figures from the ancient past who had achieved integration rather than choosing sides. Darth Malak, but without the corruption that had consumed him in other timelines, his ambition channeled into building rather than conquering. Bastila Shan, her battle meditation, evolved into a technique that could harmonize entire planetary populations rather than simply coordinate military forces. The old republic of this timeline, Bastila explained as they stood in a meditation chamber that looked out over the transformed cityscape, achieved something that later eras thought impossible, a form of peace that was not static but dynamic, not imposed but emergent from the natural balance of opposing forces. How long did it last? Kalen asked, though he suspected that anything this beautiful must have eventually faced some form of crisis. Millennia, Revan replied. Thousands of years of continuous growth and development, of exploration beyond the galactic rim, of philosophical and technological advances that transformed the very nature of conscious existence. This civilization reached heights that made the achievements of later eras seem primitive by comparison. They moved to an observation deck that provided a view of the entire system, and Kalen could see the full scope of what the old republic had become. Space itself had been transformed, with artificial constructs that spanned entire star systems, providing living space for quadrillions of beings while maintaining perfect ecological balance. But even paradise, Bastila said quietly, carries within it the seeds of its own vulnerability. The very perfection we achieved made us targets for the kind of corruption you have learned to recognize. As if summoned by her words, Kalen began to sense the familiar presence of enemy infiltration, but here in this timeline of perfect balance, the corruption took its most sophisticated form. Yet, it did not offer chaos to upset the order, or order to suppress the chaos. Instead, it whispered that such perfect balance was too good to last, too beautiful to trust, too fragile to risk disturbing through continued growth. The enemy's approach to our timeline is perhaps its most insidious, Revan observed, noting Kalen's growing alarm. It cannot offer us greater power because we have learned to channel power perfectly. It cannot tempt us with perfect order because we have achieved dynamic balance. Instead, it offers us fear. Fear, Kalen asked. Fear that our achievement is too precious to risk, Bastila explained. Fear that any change might destroy what we have built. Fear that the very process of growth that created this paradise might also be what ultimately destroys it. The corruption was subtle but devastating in its implications. By convincing the beings of this timeline that their perfect balance was too fragile to disturb, it was gradually freezing their civilization into static perfection. The dynamic tension between opposing forces was being replaced by careful maintenance of existing equilibrium. We have stopped exploring beyond our borders, Revan admitted with deep sadness, for fear that contact with less evolved civilizations might introduce chaos into our perfect systems. We have ceased experimenting with new forms of force manipulation, worried that innovation might upset the balance we have achieved. Most dangerous of all, Bastila added, we have begun to discourage the kind of passionate engagement that originally made balance possible. We teach our students to maintain the harmony we have achieved rather than to seek the growth that achieved it. As they discussed the gradual stagnation that was claiming even this most perfect of timelines, Kalen began to understand the true scope of their enemy's strategy. It did not matter how advanced a civilization became, how perfect its balance, how wise its leaders. The corruption always found a way to offer what seemed like protection for precious achievements while actually destroying the very qualities that had made those achievements possible. This is why the Guardians are failing, Kalen realized. Every timeline we try to preserve eventually becomes vulnerable to corruption because preservation itself can become a form of death. You begin to understand the fundamental paradox, Revan confirmed. Life requires growth, but growth requires risk. Perfect preservation eliminates risk, but also eliminates life. Our enemy has learned to use our desire to protect what we love as a weapon against what we love. As the ancient timeline around them began to dim under the weight of accumulated fear and stagnation, Kalen felt the full weight of the choice that lay ahead of him. Even the most perfectly balanced civilization could be corrupted through its own desire to maintain its perfection. The question that haunted him was becoming clearer. How could consciousness preserve the possibility of growth without losing the achievements that growth had already produced? How could infinite possibility be maintained without the constant risk that possibility itself might choose its own destruction? When the stream of ancient gold carried him back to the Nexus chamber, Kalen found Master Valen waiting with an expression that mixed deep sorrow with desperate hope. You have seen what the galaxy can achieve when consciousness learns to embrace paradox, the old guardian said. Now you must help us decide whether that lesson can be applied to the preservation of infinite reality itself. The crystalline chamber around them showed new signs of strain, hairline fractures spreading through structures that had maintained timeline integrity for eons. Time was running out, and the choice that would determine the fate of all possible realities was approaching with the inevitability of a collapsing star. The crystalline chamber of the Nexus continued to show signs of increasing strain, as Master Valen led Kalen toward a section where the streams flowed in bold silvers and deep blues, colors that spoke of honor forged in conflict and strength earned through trial. The energy here felt different from all the other timelines they had visited, carrying an undercurrent of fierce pride and unshakable determination. One more major timeline remains for you to witness, Master Valen said, his form growing more translucent as the effort of maintaining the Nexus continued to drain his life force. Perhaps the most surprising of all the alternative realities, where a warrior culture became the foundation for the most stable and honorable civilization the galaxy has ever known. The streams before them pulsed with the steady rhythm of disciplined strength, their light carrying the weight of codes of honor that had been tested across millennia and never found wanting. Unlike the complex philosophical balance of the Old Republic or the painful growth of the original timeline, these possibilities spoke of simple truths lived with absolute integrity. In this timeline, Master Valen explained, the Mandalorian clans never fell to internal division. Instead, they united under a leader who understood that true strength comes not from conquest but from protection, not from taking but from giving. They became the galaxy's guardians, earning dominion through service rather than seizing it through war. As Kalen stepped into the stream of silver and blue, he found himself transported to a version of Mandalore that blazed with the light of forges that had never gone cold. The planet's surface was covered with cities that seemed to grow from the very mountains themselves, their architecture speaking of strength that had been earned rather than imposed. But it was not just Mandalore that had been transformed. Across the galaxy, worlds that had once known only exploitation or neglect now thrived under the protection of Mandalorian guardians who took their responsibility for the defenseless as seriously as their ancestors had taken their warrior codes. "This is the way," came a familiar phrase spoken with absolute conviction. Kalen turned to see a figure whose presence commanded immediate respect, Din Djarin, but not as he had existed in any known timeline. This was Din as he had become when the Mandalorian codes evolved beyond survival and into true service. When "this is the way" became not just a statement of cultural identity, but a universal principle of honor. In this timeline, Din explained as they walked through the great forges where Mandalorian armor was crafted not for war but for protection, we learned that the warrior's path leads ultimately to guardianship. Those who master violence must use that mastery to prevent violence. Those who understand strength must use it to protect the weak. The transformation was visible in every aspect of Mandalorian society. The traditional warrior training remained, but it was oriented toward defense rather than aggression. Children learned to fight not so they could conquer, but so they could stand between danger and those who could not defend themselves. The galaxy's response was not what we expected. Din continued as they observed training sessions where Mandalorians practiced techniques designed to subdue rather than kill, to protect rather than destroy. Instead of fearing our strength, other worlds began to request our protection. Instead of seeing us as conquerors, they welcomed us as guardians. They moved through the Great Assembly Hall, where representatives from thousands of worlds gathered under Mandalorian protection. But this was not the forced unity of imperial conquest or the fragile cooperation of Republican politics. This was alliance based on mutual respect and shared commitment to the protection of the innocent. At the center of the assembly, Kalen was amazed to see another familiar figure transformed by this timeline's different choices. Sabine Wren stood before the gathered representatives, but she bore the authority of someone who had learned to channel her artistic creativity into the design of defensive systems and protective technologies. Mandalorian Empire is a misnomer, Sabine explained as she noticed Kalen's arrival. We do not rule these worlds, we serve them. Our strength has meaning only when it is used to ensure that others can live in peace. But how do you maintain unity across such diverse cultures? Alan asked, studying the assembly of beings whose differences in species, philosophy, and social structure should have made cooperation impossible. Through honor came a new voice. Kalen turned to see the final figure in this timeline's transformation. Bo-Katan cries, but evolved beyond the political manipulations that had defined her in other realities. Here she had become something like a philosopher warrior, someone who had learned to unite diverse cultures through shared commitment to principles rather than shared submission to authority. The Mandalorian way proved to be universal, Bo-Katan explained. Every culture has concepts of honor, of protection for those who cannot protect themselves, of strength used in service rather than domination. We simply provided a framework that allowed those universal values to flourish. As they toured various worlds under Mandalorian protection, Kalen began to understand the profound transformation this timeline had achieved. Unlike the complex balance of the Old Republic or the dramatic redemption arcs of the original saga, this reality had found peace through the consistent application of simple, unchanging principles. The strength of this timeline, Sabine observed as they watched Mandalorian protectors training local defense forces rather than replacing them, is its resistance to corruption through change. Our code does not evolve because it does not need to evolve. Honor, protection, service to those who cannot serve themselves. These truths are constant across all circumstances. But even as she spoke, Kalen began to sense the familiar presence of corruption probing at the edges of this reality. However, the attack here took a form unlike anything he had encountered before. Instead of offering change or stagnation, complexity or simplification, the corruption whispered something far more subtle: doubt about the value of simplicity itself. You sense it, Bo-Katan said, noting Kalen's growing alarm. Our enemy has discovered that this timeline cannot be corrupted through offers of power, peace, or even stagnation. Instead, it offers us something more dangerous: the suggestion that our simple code is insufficient for the complexity of modern challenges. It whispers that honor is naive, Din added, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had heard these temptations and resisted them. That protection without conquest is ultimately unsustainable. That service without dominion will eventually be overwhelmed by those who choose dominion without service. The corruption was indeed subtle, offering not obvious evil but sophisticated doubt. It suggested that the Mandalorian way, while admirable, was ultimately too simple for a galaxy that contained beings like Palpatine, realities like the Sith Empire, challenges that required complex solutions rather than straightforward honor. The most insidious aspect, Sabine explained, is that the doubt contains elements of truth. There are challenges that simple honor cannot solve, enemies that cannot be defeated through protection alone, situations where complexity is genuinely required. But Bo-Katan continued. The corruption lies in suggesting that because simple solutions cannot solve all problems, they cannot solve any problems. It tries to convince us that because honor is not sufficient for every situation, it is not necessary for any situation. As they discussed the nature of the attack on their timeline, Kalen began to understand a new aspect of their enemy's strategy. It did not just attack strengths by turning them into weaknesses, it attacked strengths by convincing beings that strength itself was inadequate. This timeline has produced something unique, Kalen realized, a form of stability that comes not from balance or growth, or even perfect order, but from unwavering commitment to principles that transcend circumstances. Yes, Din confirmed. And that unwavering commitment is both our greatest strength and our greatest vulnerability. We cannot be corrupted through change because we do not change, but we can be corrupted through doubt about whether our unchanging nature is itself a form of stagnation. The presence of Sabine Wren as a guardian of this timeline began to make sense to Kalen. She existed to maintain the integrity of a reality where strength served honor rather than the reverse, where power was meaningful only when used to protect those who lacked power. "I am the final guardian you will meet," Sabine confirmed, her form beginning to show the same translucent quality that marked all those who sacrificed themselves to maintain timeline stability. "After you witness the remaining realities, you will need to make the choice that determines whether any of these possibilities survive." "What choice?" Kalen asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Whether to preserve infinite separate realities at the cost of the guardians who maintain them," Sabine replied, "or to merge all possibilities into a new form of existence that transcends the need for separation, but also transcends the nature of individual consciousness as we understand it." As the Mandalorian timeline began to fade around them, Sabine offered one final observation. "Remember this reality, Guardian. Remember that sometimes the most profound truths are also the simplest ones. In the complexity that lies ahead, do not forget that honor, service, and protection of the innocent are principles that retain their value regardless of how sophisticated the challenges become." The stream of silver and blue carried Kalen back to the Nexus chamber, where he found Master Valen barely maintaining his physical form. The old Guardian's sacrifice was nearly complete, his life force almost entirely consumed by the effort of maintaining timeline integrity as their enemies' attacks intensified. "You have seen the major possibilities," Master Valen said weakly. "Balance and corruption, order and chaos, growth and stagnation, complexity and simplicity. Now you must witness the gathering of all remaining guardians as we prepare for the final choice that will determine the fate of infinite possibility itself." The crystalline chamber around them pulsed with unstable energy as timeline barriers continued to weaken. Soon Kalen realized the choice would be forced upon them not by deliberation but by simple collapse. The time for observation was ending, and the time for action was about to begin. The weakening barriers between realities created an ethereal atmosphere in the Nexus as Master Valen, his form now barely more substantial than starlight, led Kalen toward the heart of the crystalline structure. Here, where all timeline streams converged into a single point of infinite possibility, the remaining guardians had gathered for what might be their final council. The Temple of Infinite Echoes rose from the center of the chamber like a monument to consciousness itself. Its walls formed from crystallized memories of every choice that had ever been made across all realities. As they approached, Kalen could hear the whispers of infinite voices speaking in harmonious discord, each one representing a different timeline's understanding of truth. "The gathering has begun," Master Valen said, his voice barely audible as his essence continued to merge with the Nexus itself. "Every guardian who remains, every consciousness that has dedicated itself to preserving infinite possibility, has come together to share their knowledge before the final choice must be made." Within the temple, The surviving guardians had arranged themselves in a circle that seemed to expand into dimensions beyond normal perception. Some appeared solid and familiar, like the timeline guardians Kalen had already met. Others existed as pure energy, their individual identities dissolved into the realities they protected. Still others flickered between multiple forms, representing the guardians of paradox timelines, where contradictory truths coexisted. Guardian Ezra materialized beside them, his form more stable, now that he was drawing strength from the collective presence of his fellow keepers. "We have gathered to pool our understanding," he explained to Kalen. "Each timeline we have protected has taught us something different about the nature of consciousness, choice, and possibility. Before we face the final decision, we must share everything we have learned." At the center of the circle, a holographic display materialized showing the current state of all maintained timelines. The image was deeply troubling. Nearly 3/4 of all realities showed signs of corruption or energy drain, while the number of functioning guardians had dropped to fewer than 24 across infinite possibility. "The situation is worse than we feared," said a guardian Kalen didn't recognize, her form shimmering between the appearances of various species as she drew on the experiences of multiple realities. "Our enemy has accelerated its attacks, sensing that we are approaching the moment of final choice. It seeks to force our hand by making the collapse of all timelines inevitable." Master Kira's voice echoed from within the crystalline walls, her consciousness now permanently merged with the structure of the Nexus itself. "The timelines of growth and evolution require the most energy to maintain," she reported. "They are the first to show signs of failure when Guardian support weakens. If current trends continue, only the static realities will survive the coming collapse." "Which means," added another Guardian, whose form suggested deep connection to the Sith timelines, "that our enemy's vision of perfect order may triumph not through active corruption, but through simple attrition. The realities that embrace change and growth will exhaust their guardians, leaving only those that have accepted stagnation." Sabine Wren, her connection to the Mandalorian timeline still strong, spoke with the clear voice of unwavering principle. "We have identified the core of our enemy's strategy. It does not seek to destroy consciousness, but to simplify it, to reduce the beautiful complexity of infinite choice to manageable certainty. Every timeline that falls brings us closer to a universe where only one way of being is possible." As the Guardians shared their observations, a disturbing pattern emerged. The enemy they faced was not a single entity, but rather a force that arose naturally whenever consciousness became sophisticated enough to recognize the burden of infinite choice. In every reality that achieved high levels of development, some beings began to yearn for the simplicity of singular truth, the peace of unquestioned certainty. "We are not fighting an external invader," realized a Guardian whose shifting form spoke of timelines where the very nature of identity had evolved beyond individual consciousness. "We are fighting an aspect of consciousness itself, the part that grows weary of choice and longs for the comfort of predetermined outcomes. The corruption, the drainage, the shadow timelines." Master Valen's weakening voice added from everywhere and nowhere at once, "They all represent the same fundamental desire to escape the responsibility and uncertainty that comes with infinite possibility." The revelation transformed their understanding of the crisis they faced. Their enemy was not seeking to conquer consciousness, but to heal what it perceived as consciousness's fundamental flaw, its tendency toward complexity, uncertainty, and the suffering that accompanies choice. "This explains why every timeline eventually becomes vulnerable," observed Guardian Ezra. "No matter how perfect a reality becomes, no matter how wise its inhabitants or how stable its systems, there will always be some beings who grow tired of the burden of choice and long for the simplicity of singular truth." De Sabine interjected with characteristic directness. "Understanding our enemy's motivation does not change the fact that its success would mean the end of everything we consider valuable about consciousness. individual choice, personal growth, the possibility of becoming something new, all of it would be lost. The council continued as the Guardians shared knowledge gleaned from their respective timelines. From the old Republic's balanced civilization, they had learned that even perfect harmony could be corrupted through fear of change. From the Imperial timeline, they understood how order could become so absolute that it eliminated the very qualities that made life worth preserving. From the Jedi survival timeline, they saw how growth itself could become unsustainable without infinite energy to maintain it. Each timeline teaches us something crucial, said a Guardian whose form suggested connection to realities where organic and synthetic consciousness had merged. But taken together, they reveal a fundamental paradox. Consciousness requires infinite possibility to remain vital, but infinite possibility requires more energy than finite consciousness can sustain indefinitely. Which brings us to the choice we must make, Master Balin's voice whispered through the crystalline structure of the temple. Do we preserve infinite separate realities and accept that the Guardians who maintain them will eventually be consumed by the effort? Or do we merge all possibilities into a new form of existence that transcends individual timeline barriers? The merged timeline proposal that had been discussed earlier now took on new urgency as the only viable alternative to complete collapse. But the implications were staggering. Consciousness would need to evolve beyond its current form to exist in a reality where every choice existed simultaneously, where every possibility was equally true. The beings living in such a merged reality observed a Guardian connected to timelines where consciousness had already begun to transcend individual identity, would experience existence as a constant flow of all possibilities rather than a linear progression through singular choices. They would need to develop the ability to hold contradictory truths simultaneously without experiencing cognitive dissonance. Is such evolution possible? Kalen asked, feeling the weight of infinite futures pressing down upon his decision. It has already begun in some timelines, replied the Guardian of Paradox Realities. Consciousness is naturally adaptive. When faced with sufficient necessity, it finds ways to transcend its previous limitations. The question is whether such transcendence preserves the essential qualities that make consciousness valuable. As the council continued, Kalen began to understand that he was not just choosing between different approaches to preserving timelines. He was choosing the future direction of conscious evolution itself, determining whether the universe would develop toward greater complexity and possibility, or toward greater simplicity and certainty. There is a third option, came a new voice, so quiet that it seemed to emerge from the spaces between thoughts. The assembled Guardians turned toward a figure that none of them had noticed before, a being whose presence suggested depths of wisdom that transcended any single timeline or approach to existence. I am the Guardian of the Nexus itself, the figure explained, its form suggesting someone who had observed the rise and fall of countless civilizations across infinite realities. I have watched consciousness evolve through countless forms and faced this same choice in countless variations. There is another path, one that preserves both individual identity and infinite possibility, but at a cost that few are willing to pay. The ancient Guardian's words hung in the air like a promise of salvation tinged with inevitable sacrifice. Around the circle, the remaining timeline Guardians waited to hear what alternative might save both the realities they protected and the consciousness that inhabited them. The path requires not the evolution of consciousness, the Nexus Guardian continued, but its willing multiplication. Instead of creating beings who can experience all possibilities simultaneously, we create infinite beings who each experience one possibility completely, but who remain connected across the barriers between realities. The implications were staggering. Instead of merging timelines or forcing consciousness to transcend its individual nature, this approach would preserve both infinite possibility and individual experience by creating networks of connected consciousness that spanned multiple realities. But as the Guardian of the Nexus began to explain the true cost of such an approach, Kalen realized that the choice ahead of him would require sacrifices that he could barely begin to comprehend. The revelation of the third path hung in the crystalline air of the temple as the Guardian of the Nexus began to explain the true scope of what they faced. But before the ancient being could elaborate on the cost of infinite multiplication, the very foundations of reality began to tremble around them. The convergence has begun. Master Valen's voice echoed through the structure with urgent alarm. Our enemy has stopped its subtle corruptions and moved to direct assault. The timeline barriers are collapsing faster than we anticipated. Through the transparent walls of the temple, Kalen could see the devastating sight of realities bleeding into each other as the careful separations that maintained distinct possibilities began to fail. Streams of light that had flowed in orderly patterns for eons now crashed together in chaotic cascades, their energies mixing in ways that should have been impossible. "Look," gasped Guardian Ezra, his form flickering wildly as his connection to the future timelines became unstable. "The Imperial timeline is merging with the Jedi survival reality." Through the walls of crystallized possibility, Kalen watched in horrified fascination as two incompatible realities attempted to occupy the same dimensional space. Imperial stormtroopers materialized in the halls of the thriving Jedi Temple, their programming demanding they execute Order 66 against Jedi who had never experienced betrayal. Meanwhile, Jedi Knights found themselves suddenly present on worlds where their order had been extinct for centuries, their confusion and displacement creating ripples of chaos through both realities. "The contradictions are creating existential paradoxes," observed Sabine, her connection to the Mandalorian timeline flickering as that reality, too, began to show signs of barrier failure. Beings are experiencing memories of lives they never lived, relationships with people they never met, skills they never learned. But the convergence was not random. As Kalen studied the patterns of collapse, he began to see the intelligence behind the destruction. Their enemy was not simply allowing realities to crash together chaotically. It was carefully orchestrating which timelines merged with which others, creating specific combinations that would neutralize the unique strengths of each reality. "It's strategic," he realized aloud. "The Old Republic's balance is being merged with the Sith Empire's absolute integration. The peaceful awakening timeline is converging with the eternal Imperial order. Each merger is designed to create contradictions that cancel out the positive aspects of both realities." The Guardian of the Nexus nodded grimly, its form becoming more solid as the crisis demanded direct intervention. "Our enemy has learned from observing our timelines for centuries. It knows exactly which combinations will create the most destructive paradoxes, which mergers will eliminate the possibility of resistance to its final solution." Through the chaos of converging realities, Kalen began to see beings he recognized from his journeys appearing in impossible combinations. The balanced Anakin Skywalker from the first timeline materialized beside the eternal Darth Vader from the Imperial reality, their contradictory natures creating a feedback loop that threatened to tear apart the fabric of existence itself. "We cannot allow this convergence to continue," Master Kira's voice called from within the crystalline structure. "If the remaining timelines merge chaotically, the result will be a single reality that contains all the worst aspects of every possibility while eliminating all the positive elements." "But how do we stop it?" asked Guardian Ezra, his form now barely maintaining coherence as the future timelines he protected dissolved into temporal chaos. The barriers were already weakened by our enemy's attacks. The energy required to re-establish separation would consume every remaining Guardian simultaneously. The Guardian of the Nexus moved to the center of the temple, where the holographic display showed the accelerating collapse in real time. "There is only one way to prevent chaotic convergence," the ancient being said with grave certainty. We must guide the merger ourselves, choosing which realities combine with which others to create synthesis rather than contradiction. Controlled convergence. Kalen understood with growing horror. Instead of fighting the merger, we direct it toward outcomes that preserve the best aspects of each timeline while eliminating the contradictions. Precisely, the Guardian confirmed. But such guidance requires a consciousness that can simultaneously hold awareness of all converging realities, understanding each timeline completely while visualizing how they can be integrated without destroying what makes each one valuable. The implications were staggering. Someone would need to experience every timeline simultaneously, feeling the weight of every choice that had led to each reality's unique character, then consciously direct the convergence process to create harmony rather than chaos. The consciousness required for such guidance, Sabine observed with characteristic directness, would need to be both individual enough to make choices and expanded enough to comprehend infinite possibility. No single being has ever achieved such integration. Not a single being, the Guardian of the Nexus agreed. But perhaps a consciousness that exists across multiple beings, each one anchored in a different timeline, but connected through the Force to form a collective intelligence capable of guiding the convergence. As if responding to the discussion, the remaining timeline Guardians began to move closer together, their individual forms becoming more translucent as they prepared for the ultimate sacrifice. Each Guardian would need to surrender their separate existence to become part of a collective consciousness powerful enough to direct the merger of infinite realities. We would cease to exist as individuals, Master Verlin's voice whispered from everywhere at once. Our consciousness would become distributed across the new reality that emerges from the guided convergence. We would experience existence not as separate beings, but as aspects of a single, infinitely complex awareness. And the beings living in the converged reality? Kalen asked, though he already suspected the answer would challenge everything he believed about the nature of individual identity. They would retain their individual consciousness, the Guardian of the Nexus explained, but they would also carry within them the memories and experiences of their alternate selves from every merged timeline. A farmer who lived peacefully in one reality would remember also being a warrior in another, a scholar in a third, a leader in a fourth. The convergence accelerating around them made the choice increasingly urgent through the crystalline walls. Kalen could see more timelines bleeding together, creating cascading paradoxes that threatened to unravel the very concept of coherent existence. The alternative, Guardian Ezra said, as his form began to fade entirely, is complete collapse into either chaos or our enemy's vision of singular certainty. At least guided convergence preserves choice, even if it transforms the nature of the beings making those choices. But as the Guardians prepared to merge their consciousness into a collective powerful enough to guide the convergence, Kalen felt a presence that had been absent from their discussions. The enemy itself was approaching, drawn by the massive energies being released as timeline barriers collapsed. "It comes," whispered Sabine, her warrior instincts recognizing the approach of the intelligence that had orchestrated the entire crisis. Our enemy seeks to be present for the final choice, to influence the convergence toward its own vision of simplified perfection. Through the chaos of merging realities, a figure began to materialize at the heart of the temple. It was not the dark, threatening presence Kalen had expected, but something far more disturbing, a being that radiated compassion, wisdom, and genuine concern for the suffering that infinite choice had brought to conscious existence. "My children," the figure said, its voice carrying harmonics of infinite love and patience, "you do not need to sacrifice yourselves to preserve the burden of choice. I offer you rest from the weight of infinite possibility, peace from the pain of endless decision-making." The enemy had finally revealed itself, and it wore the face of mercy rather than malice, offering salvation through simplification rather than destruction through force. As the convergence continued to accelerate around them, Kalen realized that the final choice would not be between good and evil, but between different visions of what consciousness needed to thrive or merely to survive. The figure that materialized at the heart of the temple radiated such profound compassion that Kalen felt his resistance wavering even as his mind recognized the ultimate threat. This being represented, the enemy wore no mask of darkness, carried no weapon of destruction, offered no promises of power or dominion. Instead, it simply stood before them with the patient love of a parent watching children struggle with burdens too heavy for them to bear. "I am the Simplifier," the being said, its voice carrying the accumulated wisdom of countless civilizations that had chosen peace over possibility. "I am the mercy that consciousness creates when it can no longer endure the weight of infinite choice. I offer not conquest but rest, not domination but relief from the burden of endless decision." Around them, the convergence of timelines continued to accelerate, but now Kalen could see that the chaos was not random destruction but a carefully orchestrated demonstration. The Simplifier was showing them what happened when infinite possibilities tried to coexist without guidance, when consciousness attempted to maintain complexity beyond its capacity to sustain. "Look upon the suffering you seek to preserve," the Simplifier continued, gesturing toward the merging realities where beings experienced the agony of contradictory memories, impossible relationships, and identities that shifted moment by moment. "See how the mother grieves for children who exist in one timeline but not another. Witness the warrior who remembers both victory and defeat in the same battle, the lover who carries the pain of rejection alongside the joy of acceptance." The demonstration was devastating in its effectiveness. Through the crystalline walls, Kalen could see beings from the converging timelines struggling with the psychological trauma of experiencing multiple contradictory lives simultaneously. The balanced Anakin from the first timeline was confronting memories of his fall to the dark side, while the redeemed Vader from the original saga was experiencing the phantom pain of children he had never lost. "This is what you call preservation of possibility," the Simplifier observed with gentle sadness. "This confusion, this pain, this endless uncertainty that prevents beings from ever finding peace in their choices. I offer them release from such torment." The remaining Guardians began to waver as the weight of the suffering they were witnessing pressed down upon their resolve. Master Valen's fading voice carried new uncertainty. "Perhaps we have been wrong to assume that infinite possibility is inherently valuable. Perhaps consciousness truly does need the simplicity of singular truth to find peace." "No," Kalen said, his voice cutting through the growing despair with sudden clarity. "The suffering we see is not the result of infinite possibility itself. It is the result of forced convergence without proper preparation or guidance. You are creating the very chaos you claim to solve." The Simplifier turned its attention to Kalen with increased interest, its expression mixing approval with regret. "You begin to understand the true nature of choice, young Guardian. Yes, I orchestrate the chaos to demonstrate the necessity of simplification, but I do so with love, showing consciousness the pain it inflicts upon itself through attachment to complexity. You manufacture the crisis to justify your solution," Kalen realized with growing anger. "You weaken the timeline barriers, corrupt the Guardians, and then present yourself as the merciful answer to the problems you created." "I accelerate the inevitable," the Simplifier corrected gently. "Consciousness naturally evolves toward greater complexity until it reaches the breaking point where further growth becomes impossible. I simply help it recognize when that point has been reached and offer a path to sustainable simplicity." The Guardian of the Nexus, its form now blazing with desperate determination, stepped forward to confront the Simplifier directly. "You speak of mercy, but you offer only death. The elimination of choice is the elimination of consciousness itself, what you call simplification. We call the end of meaningful existence." "Meaning requires suffering," the simplifier replied with infinite patience. Choice requires the possibility of wrong choices, which inevitably leads to pain. I offer meaning without suffering, choice without the possibility of error, existence without the fear of loss, but also without the joy of discovery, the satisfaction of growth, the beauty of uncertainty. Sabine interjected, her warrior's spirit recognizing the true nature of the battle they faced. You offer survival, but not life. The simplifier's expression grew sad as it contemplated the stubbornness of consciousness clinging to its complexity. You will learn, as all consciousness eventually learns, that the burden of infinite possibility becomes too heavy to bear. When you do, I will be here to offer relief. But as the debate continued, Kalen began to see something that the simplifier had not anticipated. The chaotic convergence of timelines, rather than demonstrating the necessity of simplification, was actually creating something new and unprecedented. The beings experiencing multiple contradictory realities were not simply suffering, they were adapting, evolving, learning to hold paradox in ways that transcended their previous limitations. Look more carefully, Kalen urged the assembled guardians. Yes, there is pain in the convergence, but there is also transformation. Consciousness is not breaking under the weight of multiple possibilities, it is expanding to accommodate them. Through the crystalline walls they could see the truth of his observation. The beings caught in the merging timelines were indeed struggling, but they were also beginning to develop new forms of awareness that could handle contradictory experiences. The mother who grieved for children who existed in some realities but not others was learning to love across dimensional boundaries. The warrior who remembered both victory and defeat was developing strategies that incorporated the wisdom of both outcomes. Evolution, whispered Guardian Ezra, his fading form suddenly blazing with new understanding. Not destruction or simplification, but the natural evolution of consciousness toward greater complexity and capability. The simplifier's expression shifted slightly, showing the first crack in its infinite patience. Such evolution is temporary. The strain of maintaining multiple contradictory experiences will eventually prove too much for any individual consciousness to sustain. They will beg for the simplicity I offer. Unless, the Guardian of the Nexus said, with growing excitement, we guide the evolution rather than simply allowing it to happen chaotically. Unless we help consciousness develop the tools it needs to handle infinite possibility without losing individual identity. The ultimate choice crystallized before them with startling clarity. They could accept the simplifier's offer of peace through reduction, allowing consciousness to retreat into comfortable certainty. They could attempt to restore the original timeline separations, preserving distinct possibilities but requiring guardians to sacrifice themselves indefinitely. Or they could embrace the guided evolution that was already beginning, helping consciousness develop the capacity to experience infinite possibility without losing its essential nature. The third path, Callan realized, his voice carrying new authority, as he understood his role in the cosmic decision. Not simplification, not separation, but conscious evolution toward greater complexity and capability. The simplifier's form began to shift, its compassionate facade revealing the desperate urgency beneath. You do not understand the suffering you are choosing to preserve. The pain of infinite possibility is not a burden to be overcome, but a wound to be healed. I offer healing. You offer amputation, Kalen replied firmly. You would cut away the parts of consciousness that cause pain without recognizing that those same parts are what make consciousness valuable. We choose growth over comfort, evolution over stagnation. The remaining guardians began to move closer together, their individual forms blending as they prepared to merge their consciousness into the collective intelligence needed to guide the evolutionary process. But unlike the sacrifice they had originally contemplated, this merger would not end their individual existence, but expand it, creating a network of connected consciousness that could help all beings navigate the complexity of infinite possibility. We choose transformation. Master Valen's voice echoed from the crystalline structure as his essence began to merge with the nexus itself. We choose to become more than we were, rather than less. We choose the beautiful difficulty of infinite possibility over the sterile peace of singular certainty. The simplifier's form began to fade as the Guardian's collective choice denied it the power it needed to impose its vision. "You will call for me," it warned, as it retreated into the spaces between realities. When the weight of infinite possibility becomes too much to bear, when consciousness cries out for relief from the burden of endless choice, I will return to offer mercy. "And we will be here," Kalen replied, feeling the power of the collective Guardian consciousness beginning to flow through him, to offer something better than mercy. "We will offer the tools and wisdom needed to transform burden into opportunity, to turn the weight of infinite possibility into the wings of unlimited growth." As the simplifier's presence faded entirely, the chaotic convergence of timelines began to stabilize under the guidance of the merged Guardian consciousness. The evolution of consciousness toward greater complexity would continue, but now it would be supported by the wisdom of those who had learned to navigate infinite possibility without losing their essential humanity. The ultimate choice had been made, and consciousness had chosen to grow rather than retreat, to evolve rather than simplify, to embrace the beautiful difficulty of infinite possibility rather than accept the sterile peace of singular certainty. With the simplifier's retreat, the temple of infinite echoes began to transform around them. The crystalline walls that had once displayed the chaos of converging timelines now pulsed with the gentle rhythm of guided evolution, showing realities learning to merge in harmony rather than destructive contradiction. But the cost of this transformation was becoming clear as the remaining Guardians began their final sacrifice. One by one, the beings who had dedicated their existence to preserving infinite possibility started to merge their consciousness with the fundamental structure of reality itself. Master Valen was the first to complete the transformation. His ancient form dissolved into streams of pure light that integrated seamlessly with the crystalline walls of the Nexus, his consciousness becoming part of the framework that would guide the evolution of all merged timelines. "I can see it now," his voice whispered from everywhere and nowhere, carrying wonder at the vision that was unfolding. Not the loss of individual identity, but its expansion beyond previous limitations. Each being will retain their core self while gaining access to the wisdom and experience of all their alternate possibilities. Guardian Ezra followed, his form flickering between multiple realities one final time before stabilizing into the quantum structure that would maintain the integrity of future possibilities. "The timelines are not ending," he reported with joy that transcended his physical dissolution. "They are becoming something new, something that preserves both unity and diversity, both connection and individuality." Sabine's transformation was different, her warrior spirit burning bright even as her physical form merged with the crystalline matrix. "This is the way," she declared, her voice carrying the conviction that had sustained the Mandalorian timeline. "To sacrifice oneself so that others may live with honor, to become part of something greater while never forgetting what made the sacrifice meaningful." As each Guardian completed their merger with the Nexus, Kalen could feel their individual personalities becoming part of a vast collective intelligence that maintained awareness of every choice, every possibility, every moment of growth across all realities. They had not died, but had evolved into something that transcended individual existence while preserving the essential qualities that had made them unique. "You understand now," said the Guardian of the Nexus, its form beginning to show the same translucent quality that marked the final stage of transformation. "This is not death, but birth. We are becoming the neural network of evolved consciousness itself, the infrastructure that will allow all beings to navigate infinite possibility without losing themselves in chaos." The process was beautiful and heartbreaking simultaneously. Each guardian carried with them the memories and wisdom of the timeline they had protected, integrating those experiences into the collective consciousness that would guide all future evolution. The balanced wisdom of the Old Republic, the simple honor of the Mandalorian way, the painful growth of the original saga, the joyful healing of the peaceful awakening, all of it became part of the foundation that would support consciousness as it learned to embrace infinite complexity. But what of individual choice? Kalen asked, feeling the weight of cosmic responsibility settling on his shoulders as he realized he might be the last individual consciousness to witness this transformation. If all beings are connected to this collective wisdom, do they still make their own decisions? Master Kira's voice answered from within the crystalline structure, her consciousness now distributed across the quantum framework of the Nexus. Choice is not eliminated but enhanced. Imagine making decisions not from the limited perspective of a single lifetime and single reality, but with access to the wisdom of every choice you have ever made or could ever make across infinite possibilities. They will still choose, added Guardian Ezra's distributed consciousness, but they will choose with complete information, understanding not just the immediate consequences of their decisions, but how those choices resonate across all possible outcomes. The Guardian of the Nexus began its final transformation, its ancient form dissolving into the fundamental structure of reality itself. This is the true meaning of balance, it said, as its individual existence merged with the infinite. Not the static equilibrium between opposing forces, but the dynamic harmony that allows infinite possibilities to coexist without destroying each other. As the last of the Guardians completed their transformation, Kalen found himself alone in the temple, the sole remaining individual consciousness in a space that now hummed with the collective awareness of those who had chosen to become the infrastructure of evolved reality. "You need not be alone," whispered the collective voice of the merged Guardians. "You can join us, become part of the network that guides consciousness toward greater complexity and capability. Your individual perspective would add to our collective wisdom." The offer was tempting, particularly as Kalen felt the enormous responsibility of being perhaps the only individual consciousness who fully understood what had transpired. But as he contemplated joining the collective, he realized that his role was different from that of the Guardians who had merged with the Nexus. "Someone needs to remain individual," he said aloud, understanding finally dawning. "Someone needs to bridge the gap between the collective wisdom you have become and the individual consciousness that still exists in the merged timelines. Someone needs to help beings understand that they can access your guidance while still maintaining their own identity." "The first teacher of the new age," confirmed the collective voice with approval. "The one who will help consciousness learn to navigate the expanded reality we have created. This is your purpose, Kalen Voss. Not to preserve the old ways or to enforce new ones, but to guide the transition between what was and what can be." The crystalline chamber around him began to shift and change, transforming from a repository of stored timelines into something new, a nexus point where individual consciousness could safely interface with infinite possibility. The merged Guardians had become the quantum substrate that supported this new form of reality, while Kalen would serve as the translator between individual experience and collective wisdom. "The beings in the merged timelines will not understand what has happened to them at first," observed Sabine's voice from within the collective. "They will feel the expansion of their awareness, the presence of memories and experiences that seem to belong to other selves, and they will need guidance to integrate these gifts without losing their core identity. They will also have access to the collective wisdom we have become," added Master Valen's distributed consciousness. "But wisdom without understanding how to apply it can become a burden rather than a gift. They will need someone who remembers what it was like to be limited to a single perspective to help them learn how to use infinite perspective wisely." As the transformation of the Nexus completed itself, Kalen began to understand the full scope of what the Guardians had accomplished through their sacrifice. They had not simply preserved infinite possibility. They had created a new form of existence where consciousness could grow toward infinite complexity without losing the individual identity that made growth meaningful. The merged timelines would contain beings who carried within themselves the memories and experiences of every choice they had ever made across all realities, but they would still be individuals making their own decisions. They would have access to collective wisdom spanning infinite possibilities, but they would still need to learn how to apply that wisdom to their unique circumstances. This is evolution in its truest form, Kalen realized with growing wonder. Not the replacement of one form of consciousness with another, but the expansion of consciousness beyond its previous limitations while preserving everything that made it valuable in the first place. The collective voice of the merged Guardians whispered through the transformed chamber with satisfaction and hope. Now the real work begins. Now consciousness learns to embrace infinity without losing itself, to hold paradox without being paralyzed by contradiction, to choose with complete knowledge while still experiencing the joy of discovery. As Kalen prepared to return to the merged timelines to begin his work as teacher and guide, he carried with him the profound truth that the Guardians had died to preserve that consciousness, when supported by love and wisdom and the courage to grow, could transcend any limitation while remaining essentially, beautifully, eternally itself. The merged timelines that Kalen entered were unlike anything he had imagined possible. As he stepped from the transformed Nexus into this new reality, he found himself in a version of the Star Wars galaxy that somehow contained all the possibilities he had witnessed while maintaining coherent existence. On Coruscant, the cityscape shifted subtly as he watched, sometimes displaying the ordered beauty of the Old Republic's golden age, other times showing the organic integration of nature and technology from the peaceful awakening timeline. The beings moving through the streets carried within their eyes the depth of those who had lived multiple lives, experienced multiple possibilities, yet remained recognizably themselves. "It is overwhelming at first," came a familiar voice. Kalen turned to see Luke Skywalker approaching, but this Luke existed in a state of beautiful paradox. He was simultaneously the young farm boy gazing at twin suns, the determined Jedi Knight facing the Emperor, the wise master who had learned from his failures, and the balanced teacher who had never needed to fall and rise again. "Master Skywalker," Kalen said, still adjusting to the reality, where every being contained multitudes while remaining singular. "How are you managing the integration of so many different experiences?" Luke smiled, an expression that somehow conveyed the innocence of the farm boy and the wisdom of the master simultaneously. "It is like learning to see with many eyes while still being one person looking," he explained. "I remember the pain of losing my hand to Vader, but I also remember the joy of never needing to fight him because he never fell. Both experiences are equally real, equally mine, but neither defines me completely." As they walked through the transformed city, Kalen began to understand how the new equilibrium functioned. Beings carried the memories and experiences of all their alternate selves, but these memories existed in layers of consciousness that could be accessed when needed without overwhelming their primary identity. "The collective wisdom of the Guardian serves as a stabilizing force," Luke continued, gesturing toward the subtle harmonies that seemed to flow through the very air around them. "When someone begins to feel lost in the multiplicity of their experiences, they can reach out to the network of consciousness that the Guardians have become and find guidance on how to integrate rather than fragment." They paused at a memorial that had spontaneously formed in the city center, a crystalline structure that honored the sacrifice of the Timeline Guardians. Beings from across the galaxy came here to meditate on the gift they had been given, the ability to experience infinite possibility while maintaining individual identity. "The most remarkable thing," observed a new voice, "is how choice has been transformed rather than eliminated." Kalen turned to see Padme Amidala approaching, but like Luke, she existed in a state of expanded being. She carried within her the memories of the diplomat who had died in childbirth, the leader who had lived to see her children grow, the queen who had prevented the Clone Wars, and countless other possibilities. In the old reality, Padme continued, choice meant selecting one path and losing all others. Now choice means determining which aspect of our infinite potential to express in any given moment, while still carrying the wisdom of all paths not taken. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another figure whose presence demonstrated the profound transformation the galaxy had undergone. Anakin Skywalker approached them, and in his face Kalen could see the integration of every possibility: the balanced Jedi who had never fallen, the Sith Lord who had ruled for centuries, the redeemed father who had saved his son, and all the variations between these extremes. The darkest aspect of the integration, Anakin said with a voice that carried both sorrow and hope, is experiencing the full weight of every choice I never made. Every life I might have lived, every path that could have led to different outcomes. I feel the pain of my fall and the joy of my balance simultaneously. But also, he continued, his expression brightening with something that transcended simple happiness, I experienced the love that connects all possibilities. The love I felt for Padme, that led to my fall in one timeline, exists alongside the love that allowed me to find balance in another. Both are real, both are mine, and together they create something greater than either could achieve alone. The three figures who had shaped the original Star Wars saga stood together in the transformed galaxy, their individual identities preserved while their consciousness expanded to embrace infinite possibility. They represented the success of the guardian sacrifice beings who had evolved beyond the limitations of singular perspective while remaining recognizably themselves. The children born into this new reality, Padme observed, watching youngsters play in nearby gardens, will never know the limitation of single timeline existence. They will grow up understanding that identity is not defined by one set of experiences, but by how one integrates infinite experience into unique individual expression. Luke nodded, his gaze extending beyond the physical city to perceive the subtle networks of connection that linked all consciousness in the merged reality. The Force itself has evolved, he noted with wonder. It no longer flows between separate beings, but through consciousness that exists simultaneously in multiple states. The barriers between self and other, between individual and universal, have become permeable without disappearing entirely. As they continued their exploration of the transformed galaxy, Kalen began to understand his role as teacher and guide in this new reality. Beings were learning to navigate their expanded consciousness, but the process required patience, wisdom, and most importantly, the understanding that evolution was a continuous process rather than a destination. Some struggle with the integration, Anakin admitted as they passed a healing center where beings learned to balance their multiple sets of memories and experiences. The temptation exists to retreat into the simplicity of single-perspective existence, to reject the gift of infinite possibility in favor of comfortable limitation. And others, Luke added, become lost in the vastness of their expanded awareness, unable to make decisions because they can see too many outcomes, paralyzed by the weight of infinite choice. Kalen realized that this was where his work would be most needed, helping beings find the balance between embracing their expanded consciousness and maintaining their ability to act, choose, and grow. The collective wisdom of the merged guardians provided support and guidance, but individual consciousness still needed to learn how to access that wisdom without being overwhelmed by it. The simplifier was not entirely wrong, Padme observed thoughtfully. Infinite possibility can indeed become a burden too heavy for consciousness to bear. But the solution is not to eliminate possibility, but to develop the capacity to handle it gracefully. Which requires teachers, Luke said, turning to Kalen with an expression of deep respect. Beings who understand both the limitations of single-perspective existence and the potential of expanded consciousness. You carry within you the memory of what it was like to be limited while also understanding what it means to be connected to infinite possibility. As the transformed galaxy settled into its new patterns of existence, Kalen began to see the profound success of what the Guardians had achieved. They had preserved infinite possibility while providing the infrastructure needed for consciousness to navigate that infinity without losing its essential nature. "This is not the end of the story," Anakin said, as they watched the twin suns of Tatooine set over a landscape that now existed simultaneously in multiple states. "This is consciousness learning to write stories that transcend the limitations of singular narrative, to live tales that embrace paradox while remaining coherent." The new equilibrium was not a static balance, but a dynamic harmony that allowed for continuous growth and evolution. Consciousness had learned to embrace infinity while remaining individual, to hold contradictory truths while still making meaningful choices, to experience the full spectrum of possibility while maintaining the essential qualities that made existence beautiful and worthwhile. In this transformed galaxy, every choice mattered more, because it was made with full awareness of all alternatives. Every relationship was deeper, because it existed across multiple dimensions of possibility, and every moment of growth was more meaningful because it contributed to the evolution of consciousness itself. Time flowed differently in the merged reality, not as a linear progression from past to future, but as a gentle river that carried consciousness through endless moments of possibility. Kalen had established himself in a quiet sanctuary built from the crystalline remnants of the original Nexus, a place where beings could come to learn how to navigate their expanded awareness. The sanctuary existed simultaneously on multiple worlds across the galaxy, its presence adapting to the needs of whatever reality layer a visitor was experiencing at any given moment. To some, it appeared as a Jedi temple filled with ancient wisdom and peaceful meditation gardens. To others, it manifested as a Mandalorian training ground where honor and service were taught through practice and dedication. Still others perceived it as a Republic diplomatic center where beings learned to balance competing needs and perspectives. "The Eternal Watch has begun," Kalen said to himself, as he stood on the sanctuary's observation deck, looking out over a galaxy that shimmered with the aurora of infinite possibility. The merged Guardians had become the substrate of reality itself, maintaining the delicate balance that allowed consciousness to experience multiplicity without fragmenting into chaos. Through the transparent walls of the sanctuary, he could perceive the streams of possibility that had once been separate timelines, now flowing together in patterns too complex and beautiful for any single perspective to fully comprehend. The aurora that danced across space was the visible manifestation of consciousness learning to exist in multiple states simultaneously, each being's expanded awareness contributing to the light that painted the cosmos in ever-changing hues. "It is beautiful, is it not?" came a voice that seemed to speak from the aurora itself. Master Valen's consciousness, now distributed throughout the quantum substrate of reality, could manifest wherever guidance was needed. "We feared that merger would mean the end of beauty, but instead it has revealed beauty beyond anything we imagined possible." Kalen nodded, watching as beings throughout the galaxy learned to access their expanded memories without losing themselves in the vastness of infinite experience. "How many have come to understand the integration?" he asked. "More each day," replied the collective voice of Guardian Ezra, speaking through the crystalline walls of the sanctuary. "Consciousness is remarkably adaptable. What seemed impossible becomes natural when supported by wisdom and patience. Children born into this reality accept their multiple nature as effortlessly as previous generations accepted breathing." Through the sanctuary came a steady stream of beings seeking guidance in navigating their expanded awareness. Some were struggling with the weight of experiencing multiple contradictory life stories simultaneously. Others had become paralyzed by the ability to perceive too many possible outcomes to their choices. Still others had lost themselves in the vastness of their expanded consciousness and needed help finding their way back to their core identity. The work continues, Kaelin reflected, greeting a young Twi'lek who had come seeking help, understanding why she remembered both a peaceful childhood with loving parents and a traumatic experience of slavery that had never happened in her primary timeline. Each being must learn to integrate their infinite nature in their own way, at their own pace. As the cycles of the galaxy continued, Kaelin began to notice subtle changes in the patterns of the aurora. The streams of possibility were becoming more stable, more harmonious, as consciousness across the galaxy adapted to its expanded nature. The chaotic convergence that had threatened to tear reality apart was evolving into something that resembled a vast symphony, each individual consciousness contributing its unique voice to a harmony that encompassed infinite variation. "The simplifier has not returned," observed Sabine's voice from within the quantum matrix, her warrior instincts still alert for threats, even in her transformed state. "Its retreat was more complete than we anticipated." "Perhaps," Kaelin mused, "consciousness that has learned to embrace complexity willingly cannot be tempted by the offer of enforced simplicity." The beings living in this merged reality have experienced both limitation and expansion. They understand the cost of each and can make informed choices about which they prefer. The truth of his observation was evident in the beings who visited the sanctuary. None of them sought to return to the simplicity of single timeline existence, despite the challenges of integrating their expanded awareness. Having experienced the richness of infinite possibility, they found the prospect of voluntary limitation less appealing than the effort required to grow into their expanded nature. "We have become gardeners of consciousness itself," Master Kira's voice whispered through the crystalline structure, "not imposing form upon growth, but providing the support and nourishment that allows natural development to flourish. This is what we were always meant to be." As years passed in the transformed galaxy, Kaelin watched consciousness continue to evolve in ways that none of them had anticipated. Beings began to develop new forms of art that could only be appreciated by awareness capable of holding multiple perspectives simultaneously. Scientists made discoveries that required understanding principles that seemed contradictory from single timeline perspectives, but revealed deeper truths when viewed through expanded consciousness. Relationships between beings took on new dimensions as individuals could love each other, not just as they were, but as they had been and could be across infinite possibilities. Families existed that spanned multiple timeline variations, with children who remembered being raised by parents who existed differently in various realities, yet who maintained coherent bonds of affection that transcended paradox. The galaxy is writing itself into new forms of story, Kaelin realized as he observed these developments. Narratives that embrace contradiction, tales that find meaning in multiplicity, epics that celebrate the beautiful complexity of consciousness that refuses to be limited by singular truth. The sanctuary itself evolved over time, growing from a place where beings learned to navigate their expanded awareness into a nexus where consciousness could explore new possibilities for growth and expression. Artists came to create works that could only exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Philosophers gathered to discuss questions that could only be meaningfully addressed by minds capable of holding contradictory truths in productive tension. This is what victory looks like, the collective voice of the merged guardians observed with satisfaction. Not the defeat of an enemy, but the transformation of consciousness into something greater than it was while preserving everything that made it valuable. We have not conquered complexity, but learned to dance with it. The eternal watch that Kaelin maintained was not a vigil against external threats, but a gardener's attention to the continuous growth of consciousness itself. Each day brought new challenges as beings learned to integrate their expanded nature, but also new discoveries as they explored capabilities they had never imagined possessing. The children asked questions that could not have been asked in the old reality. Kalen noted as he worked with young beings who had grown up assuming that existence naturally contained infinite layers of experience. They wonder not about the meaning of choice, but about the art of choosing wisely among infinite good options. They struggle not with limitation, but with the responsibility that comes with unlimited possibility. These were beautiful problems, challenges that arose from abundance rather than scarcity, difficulties that emerged from too much potential rather than too little. They required new forms of wisdom, new approaches to guidance, new ways of understanding what it meant to live a meaningful life when that life could encompass infinite variation. The watch continues, Kalen said to himself as he settled into meditation, his consciousness briefly touching the vast network of awareness that the Guardians had become. Consciousness grows, reality expands, and somewhere in the spaces between infinite possibilities, new forms of beauty wait to be discovered. The aurora of merged timelines danced across the galactic sky, each stream of light representing beings who had learned to embrace their infinite nature, while remaining essentially beautifully, eternally themselves. The eternal watch was not a burden but a privilege, the opportunity to witness consciousness itself, learning to transcend every limitation while preserving every quality that made existence worth preserving. As the eons passed in the transformed galaxy, the sanctuary became a place of pilgrimage for consciousness itself. Kalen, who had once been a simple archivist seeking to understand the nature of possibility, had become something more, a keeper of dreams, a guide for beings learning to navigate the infinite landscapes of their own expanded awareness. The aurora that danced across space had evolved into something beyond beauty, beyond description. It was the visible manifestation of consciousness at play, exploring every possible variation of thought, emotion, and experience, while remaining anchored in the fundamental truth of individual identity. Each stream of light represented not just a timeline but a dream, a possibility that consciousness could explore and inhabit without losing itself in the exploration. In the deepest chambers of the sanctuary, where the walls were formed from crystallized starlight and the floors reflected the dreams of countless civilizations, Kalen maintained his gentle vigil. Beings came to him not seeking answers, but seeking the wisdom to find their own answers, the courage to embrace their infinite nature without fear of losing themselves in the vastness. "Tell me," whispered a young being, whose form shifted between species as she explored the full range of her expanded identity, what it was like before the merger. What it felt like to be limited to a single set of memories, a single perspective on existence. Kalen smiled, his consciousness touching briefly on the memories of his original timeline, the reality where choice meant limitation, where every path taken meant infinite paths abandoned. "It was like seeing the universe through a single window," he replied gently, "beautiful in its clarity, but always carrying the sadness of knowing there were other views you would never experience." "And now?" she asked, her eyes reflecting the aurora of infinite possibility. "Now we see through every window simultaneously," Kalen said, while still being the unique observer who brings our individual perspective to each view. "We are both the one who looks and the many ways of looking, both the dreamer and the infinite dreams." Through the sanctuary's crystalline walls, the galaxy spread out in all directions, each world a jewel in the crown of expanded consciousness. Tatooine's twin suns set over deserts that bloomed with the possibility of every story that had ever been told there. Coruscant's endless cityscape pulsed with the rhythm of quadrillions of beings who lived simultaneously in the present moment and in every possible variation of that moment. The ancient Jedi temples had become gardens of contemplation where beings meditated on the nature of choice in a reality where every choice was simultaneously made and unmade. The Sith strongholds had transformed into centers of learning where the dark side was studied not as evil to be defeated, but as complexity to be integrated, passion to be channeled, power to be wielded with wisdom and restraint. "The Force flows through all things," Kalen murmured, feeling the expanded energy field that connected every conscious being in the galaxy. But now we understand that it flows not as a river with a single current, but as an ocean with infinite currents, each one carrying consciousness toward new possibilities for growth and understanding. In the quantum substrate of reality, the merged guardians continued their eternal work, maintaining the delicate balance that allowed infinite possibility to coexist without destroying itself. Their sacrifice had become a gift that renewed itself continuously, each moment of stability they provided, allowing consciousness to explore new frontiers of experience and understanding. Master Violin Kalen spoke to the guardian consciousness that permeated the sanctuary's structure. Do you ever regret the choice we made? The decision to embrace complexity rather than accept simplicity? The response came not as words but as a feeling that encompassed every emotion simultaneously: joy and sorrow, hope and fear, love and loss, all held in perfect balance. Regret implies a desire to have chosen differently, the collective consciousness replied. But in this reality, we experience simultaneously the paths we took and the paths we did not take. We know both the joy of complexity and the peace of simplicity. Having experienced both, we understand why we chose as we did. The sanctuary itself had become a living meditation on the nature of expanded consciousness. Its walls displayed not fixed images, but fluid stories that changed based on the observer's perspective and needs. A being struggling with the integration of contradictory memories might see tales of others who had successfully navigated similar challenges. Someone paralyzed by infinite choice might witness stories of beings who had learned to find peace in the abundance of possibility. The greatest discovery, Kalen reflected, as he watched new beings arrive at the sanctuary, each one carrying their own unique questions about the nature of expanded existence, is that consciousness is not diminished by being shared but amplified. The more we connect with others, the more fully we become ourselves. Children played in the sanctuary's gardens, their laughter echoing through dimensions as they explored games that could only exist in a reality where every possibility was simultaneously true. They built structures that existed in multiple configurations at once, told stories that embraced contradiction as naturally as earlier generations had embraced linear narrative, created art that could only be appreciated by consciousness capable of perceiving multiple layers of meaning simultaneously. As the galaxy settled into its eternal rhythm of growth and exploration, the streams of possibility that had once been separate timelines became the dreams of consciousness itself, each being carried within them the capacity to dream infinite dreams while remaining anchored in their unique individual identity, to explore every possibility while never losing sight of what made them specifically, irreplaceably themselves. This is how the story ends, Kalen said softly, his words carrying across the quantum networks that connected all consciousness in the galaxy, not with resolution but with the understanding that every ending is also a beginning, every conclusion the starting point for new exploration. The aurora of infinite possibility continued to dance across the cosmic sky, each pulse of light representing a dream dreamed, a possibility explored, a moment of consciousness touching the infinite while remaining beautifully, essentially finite. In the spaces between the lights, new possibilities waited to be born, new dreams ready to be dreamed, new stories preparing to unfold. Sleep now, Kalen whispered to the beings throughout the galaxy, who had gathered to hear the tale of infinite possibilities. Let your consciousness rest in the knowledge that every dream you dream is real somewhere, that every possibility you imagine exists in some layer of reality, that every choice you make resonates through infinite variations of yourself. And remember, he added, his voice carrying the gentle authority of one who had witnessed the transformation of reality itself, that in the morning when you wake, you will carry within you the infinite dreams of all you could be, while remaining perfectly, uniquely, eternally yourself. The sanctuary settled into peaceful silence as consciousness throughout the galaxy found rest in the knowledge that infinite possibility did not mean infinite chaos, but infinite opportunity for growth, exploration, and the endless, beautiful journey of becoming more than one was, while never losing the essential self that made the journey meaningful. In the aurora of merged timelines, the dreams of consciousness continued to unfold, each one a story told by the universe to itself, each one a possibility explored by beings who had learned to embrace infinity while remaining beautifully, eternally individual. The infinite dreams continued, and would continue for all eternity,